In the year 72 of our current era, in the heart of the great city of Rome, there was born in chains a child who would come to be called Demetrius. His parents were slaves belonging to a wealthy family. His mother had been born in the far eastern provinces, somewhere along the Bosporus, perhaps, while his father came from the north, most likely from Greece. But Demetrius himself was born in Rome, and although he knew nothing of the places his parents had come from, Rome was his home. He was born in the atrium of the house, where he would live his entire life. In the atrium, the floor was made of stone and cold. The first sensation on his tiny newborn body was the hardness of the stone floor. It was not uncommon for small children to sleep out in the open air in the atrium, and it was in this way that the slaves lived. Even after they were old enough to understand, even after they were strong enough to move themselves, his earliest memories were of lying on the cold stone floor, surrounded by the smells of incense and oil, and the sound of the fire crackling in the hearth nearby. He remembered the smoke curling into the air, and how it tickled his eyes and nostrils. Sometimes when he lay awake, he could hear the faint sound of voices, raised voices sometimes, men and women talking about things that he couldn't quite make out. Then there was always the low rumble of the city itself, the sound of carts and animals crossing the nearby streets, distant shouts and laughter from the playgrounds, and over it all, the incessant drone of flies in the summertime. There were also the sounds of the house itself, slaves going about their duties, pots being put down and picked up again, the scrape of a stool being pulled out, splash of water into a basin, the clank of metal cups and bowls being put away. But his favorite sound was the sound of a young girl singing softly as she went about her tasks. He never saw her, but he loved the sound of her voice. He asked his mother one day who the girl was, but his mother just sighed and told him to go back to sleep. There was nothing for him to understand about such things. He was just a little boy. And indeed, for many years, Demetrius did nothing but play on the stone floor of the atrium and watch the adults bustle about. His mother worked as a servant in the kitchen, so he often heard her moving about and making preparations for breakfast and lunch and dinner. She would leave the atrium and go into the kitchen and then return, carrying a piece of bread or some fruit. For him, it seemed like she was gone for hours at a time. When she returned, she would sit down beside him and slowly eat her food while he watched her. She rarely spoke, but sometimes she would hum a tune in a language that sounded like the lapping of waves on the shore. This is the song his mother used to sing to him when he was very small, before he could walk or talk. And she would rock him gently on her knee and sing, and he would fall asleep. While his mother was at work, his father would watch over him. His father was a strong man with hands like iron. He looked hard and weathered, like a piece of driftwood that had been tossed about on the sea for many years. But he was kind to Demetrius. He would sit down beside him and stroke his hair and tell him stories about faraway lands. He told him about sailing ships and bustling marketplaces and silver coins heavier than a man's head. But Demetrius's favorite story was the one about a beautiful princess trapped in a tall tower, and a brave young prince who came to rescue her. His father would raise his voice as he told the story, and then fall silent as the prince and princess embraced. Then he would look at Demetrius and smile sadly and say, "Not every story has a happy ending, my son. Some stories end with the prince reaching the top of the tower, only to find that the princess has already been taken by another." When his father was not telling him stories, Demetrius would play with bits of ash that lay on the floor. It was common for slaves to burn their trash in a brazier in the courtyard, and then the ash would be scattered by the wind and carried into the atrium. Demetrius liked to arrange the ash into shapes, towers and walls and boats. He liked to pretend that he was building his own city, a city made of ash and dust and dreams. One day a woman entered the atrium. She was tall and thin, with sharp features and angry eyes. This was his mistress, the woman to whom his father belonged. She wasn't his mistress in the same way that other women were mistresses. That is to say, she wasn't a mistress of the house. She was a mistress of slaves, and her specialty was breaking the spirits of slaves. She approached Demetrius and picked him up and examined him as though he were an object that she had just purchased. She smelled faintly of lavender and vinegar. "So this is the spawn of the dog," she said, and threw him back down onto the ground. "A worthless slave amongst worthless slaves. You will never amount to anything, you and your kind. She spat on the ground. I hate your kind. You are nothing but trouble. You are nothing but expense. You are nothing but loss. I curse you and all your kind." After she left, Demetrius's father picked him up and held him close and told him not to listen to the words of such a wicked person. "She does not know what she says," his father whispered. "She is a cruel and bitter woman who has never known happiness. Do not let her words upset you. She is not worth it." When Demetrius was old enough, he began doing little jobs around the house. At first it was just bringing his father his sandal when he asked for it. His father would come into the atrium and see him playing with his sandal, and he would smile and pick it up and wear it. And Demetrius thought this was the greatest honor. Later, he was given bigger and harder tasks, fetching water, cleaning the toilets, tending to the fires in the hearth. All of this was done in silence, for if the slaves were ever to speak up, they would be punished severely. They were to be seen and not heard. So Demetrius learned to keep his mouth shut and do as he was told. If he saw a free child in the street, he would envy them for a moment. Free children could run and jump and play and shout and laugh. They could say whatever they wanted and do whatever they wanted. But then the free children would run off and hide when the soldiers came to collect taxes, and they would whisper to their mothers, who would cover their mouths with linen cloths and rush into the kitchens to prepare dinner. And he realized that free children were not necessarily happier than he was. Sometimes when he walked through the market with his father, he would stop and watch the fish being sold. The fishmonger would hold up the freshly caught fish and let the potential buyers run their fingers across its scales. He liked the smell of fish. It reminded him of his father's stories about the sea. The fishmonger would always have fresh loaves of bread to give the fish its flavor. And Demetrius would watch as the slaves took the bread and rubbed it against the fish and then ate it up. He liked the smell of fresh bread and the sight of it being torn apart. One day a piece of bread was thrown to the ground and Demetrius reached down to pick it up. But a guard shouted at him and chased him away. The bread was not for him. As he grew older, he spent more and more time in the kitchen with his mother, learning how to cook and clean and serve. Most of the food was brought in already prepared by the servants from the country estate. But there were still many tasks to be done. On market days, however, the kitchen would be filled with activity. Baskets and baskets of fruit and vegetables would arrive, carried in by poor farmers who had grown them and were now selling them in the city. There were always new dishes to be prepared, new tastes to be sampled, new foods to be cooked, and the kitchen would fill with enticing smells. At night, when everyone was asleep, he would sneak into the pantry and eat figs and dates and olives and cheese. The pantry smelled faintly of oil, and the soft leather bags in which the goods were kept smelled faintly of oil too. He would smear oil on his skin and fall asleep feeling clean and cared for. For a slave, there was no real difference between summer and winter. They worked the same, and they suffered the same. They sweated in the summer heat, and they shivered in the winter cold. The only difference was that the summer days were longer and the winters were shorter. The master's children ran and played in the streets. The slave children were forced to stay indoors and clean the latrines. But the masters did make sure that all the sandals of their slaves were repaired in time for the new year, and it was during these sandal repair sessions that Demetrius and the other slaves got to hear stories of the outside world. The old sandal maker was a spry old woman with a shock of white hair and eyes like polished amber. She had been a slave for more than 60 years, longer than most people lived, and she had stories to tell about everything, about the good emperors and the bad emperors, about wars and plagues and earthquakes. Her favorite story was the one about a slave who had become emperor. It was a story full of twists and turns and betrayals. And the old woman would always sigh at the end of it and shake her head. And so began the rhythm of their lives. Let us begin with the hush of twilight settling over the Roman Forum, the air heavy with the day's heat and the smell of wood smoke from nearby shops. Here, right in the heart of the marble columns and echoing halls of power, our story kicks off. You wake up, blinking against the soft glow of the dim oil lamp, feeling the rough stone walls around you. The room is tiny, just enough space for the straw pallet you share with 3 others, all of you crammed together like sardines. It's cozy in a way, but you can't shake the feeling of being trapped, you know? A trickle of water runs through a cracked clay pipe overhead, mixing with the stench of stale sweat and waste. The window is barred, offering a glimpse of a sliver of sky above the rooftops. Outside, the sounds of awakening Rome filter through the stone, a lullaby of carts, vendors, and roosters. Your stomach growls, a familiar pang that never quite goes away. You rise stiffly, your limbs protesting the countless hours spent in this cramped space. In the dim light, you see the faces of your fellow slaves, worn and weathered like old leather. You greet them with a curt nod, each silently counting the hours until freedom, or perhaps just the next meal. Today is your 34th birthday, a fact known only to the gods and the lines etched on your face. You are property, a nameless asset to your master, and age is a number he does not concern himself with. Breakfast is a thin porridge, watery and bland. You eat quickly, always mindful of the time, for each hour has its task. After the brief respite, your mistress calls you, her sharp voice cutting through the morning calm. She is tall and slender with hair like spun gold and eyes that seem to pierce through you. You have served her family for as long as you can remember, and she, like the rest of your masters, remains a distant, unknowable figure. You dress quickly, pulling on the coarse linen tunic that hangs loosely on your gaunt frame. Your bare feet hit the stone floor, cold and hard beneath your arches. You move with practiced efficiency, years of servitude making you adept at anticipating your mistress's needs. The day unfolds in a series of tasks, each one blending into the next. For your mistress, it's a symphony of orders, each one a delicate chime demanding your attention. You polish silver until it gleams, clean marble floors until they shine, and arrange flowers in silver vases. Outside, the summer sun beats down, turning the city into a furnace. You long for the shade, but your place is indoors, far from the eyes of the world. As the day wanes, so do your hopes. But you press on, sustained by the promise of rest. Dinner is a meager affair, a bowl of thin soup and a crust of bread. Afterward, you return to your pallet, the night air bringing little relief from the day's grime. Sleep comes fitfully, punctuated by the snores of your companions and the distant rumble of the city's nocturnal restlessness. And so the days turn into weeks, months, and finally years. Your back grows more bent, your hands more gnarled, and the faces of your masters become a blur. You see the seasons change through the windows, but the sun and rain mean little to you. You are a fixture in this grand house, as unchanging as the marble walls and as fleeting as the shadows they cast. Yet amidst the quiet sameness, there is change. You notice a young boy in the household, a slave like you, but younger, smaller, with eyes full of wonder. His name is Demetrius, and you find yourself drawn to his untamed spirit. He reminds you of a time when you too were new to this life, when hope still flickered within you. You teach him the rhythms of the house, the ways of survival, and he listens intently, his mind sharp even at his tender age. One day, Demetrius comes to you with a question. "How old are you?" he asks, his voice innocent and clear. You pause, surprised by the query. Age is of little consequence here, yet the boy's question lingers. You think back to the days of your youth, to a time before servitude claimed you. You remember your parents' smiling faces, the warmth of a mother's embrace, the sound of your own laughter. But these memories are faded tapestries, hanging in the attic of your mind. Still, you piece them together, creating a narrative of a life that could have been. Old enough to remember, you say to the boy, your voice raspy with disuse. Old enough to have seen many summers. Demetrius nods, his brow furrowed in thought. "I won't be a slave for long," he says suddenly, his eyes gleaming with youthful certainty. "I will buy my freedom, and then I will travel the world." His words hang in the air, audacious and hopeful. You look at the boy, his spirit a stark contrast to the shadows that define your existence. You want to believe in his dream, to feel the embers of hope rekindle within you. But years of servitude have tempered your spirit. "Dreams are for the free, little one," you say softly. "Our lives are measured by our master's will." Despite your words, Demetrius's spirit touches you, reminding you of dreams long abandoned. That night, as you lie on your pallet, the stars seem closer, their light filtering through the cracks in the ceiling. You think of Demetrius and his dreams. For a moment, you forget your chains. Years pass, and Demetrius grows older. His youthful exuberance is tempered by the harsh realities of servitude. yet his spirit remains unbroken. You watch him train in the courtyard, his lithe form leaping and twisting with a grace that reminds you of the freedom you once dreamed of. One day, Demetrius comes to you with a plan. He has saved his meager earnings and devised a strategy to win his freedom. "Help me," he asks, his eyes shining with determination. "Together, we can buy our freedom and start a new life." You hesitate, torn between the safety of routine and the faint glimmer of hope. In the end, you agree. You, too, have tasted the bitterness of unending servitude and yearn for something more. Your plan unfolds under the cloak of night. With trembling hands, you count out your savings, each coin a testament to years of toil. Demetrius meets you in the courtyard, his face pale in the moonlight. Together, you slip out of the house, leaving behind the only life you've ever known. The city is a labyrinth of dark alleys and moonlit squares. You navigate its twists and turns, guided by the promise of dawn. As the first rays of sunlight touch the horizon, you reach a crossroads. Before you lies the open road, stretching into the unknown. Demetrius turns to you, his face etched with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Are you ready, old friend?" he asks, his voice husky with emotion. You look into his eyes, seeing the reflection of your own yearning for freedom. "Ready as I'll ever be," you reply. Side by side, you walk away from the city, the weight of your shackles a distant memory. Ahead, the road undulates, promising both challenges and wonders. The sun climbs higher, casting long shadows behind you. As the day wears on, you feel a lightness in your step, a sense of liberation that belies the miles still ahead. You talk in hushed voices, sharing stories of the life you've left behind and dreams for the one that lies ahead. You speak of distant lands, of bustling marketplaces and rolling hills, of a world beyond the confines of your former existence. The sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet. You find shelter for the night. Your body's weary, your spirits high. As the darkness deepens, you huddle together for warmth, the comfort of companionship chasing away the creeping chill. You tell stories, each word a flickering flame in the gathering darkness. The tales carry you through the night, keeping the loneliness at bay. With the first hint of dawn, you rise, refreshed and renewed. The rising sun bathes the world in a golden light, mirroring the hope that flickers within you. As the day progresses, the road becomes your sanctuary, the rhythm of your steps, a soothing melody. The world unfolds before you, a panorama of sights and sounds that stir your soul. You see fields of ripening grain, vineyards heavy with fruit, and groves of olive trees laden with their precious yield. Each landmark is a victory, each mile a testament to your enduring spirit. The journey continues, the road unwinding like a ribbon in the fading light. The pace slows, the initial eagerness giving way to the quiet determination. You walk in silence, each absorbed in their thoughts, the shared history between you, a silent companion. The sun dips below the horizon, signaling the end of your journey. Ahead, you see the welcoming lights of a small village, a beacon in the gathering dusk. Hand in hand you enter the village, the echoes of your footsteps, mingling with the sounds of evening life. The air is filled with the scent of cooking fires and the murmur of voices, creating a symphony of human warmth. The village offers a temporary haven, a place to rest and gather strength for whatever lies ahead. And as the fire crackles, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls of your shelter, you know that the road ahead may be long and arduous, but you are not alone. In the flickering firelight, you find solace. The warmth seeping into your tired bones, chasing away the lingering chill of the road. You are surrounded by the symphony of the night, the chirping of crickets, and the distant hoot of an owl, a chorus that lulls you into a peaceful slumber. When you awake, the first rays of sunlight paint the sky in hues of rose and gold, beckoning you to greet a new day. With the dawning of a fresh day you arise, your spirits lifted by the boundless possibilities that lie ahead. The road stretches before you, an open book, each bend offering a new chapter in the story of your freedom. You are filled with a sense of purpose, driven by the dream of a life lived on your own terms. The road winds through verdant valleys and over sun-drenched hills, becoming a tapestry of experiences woven with the threads of resilience and hope. The burdens of the past fall away with each step, replaced by the lightness of newfound resolve. As you continue your journey, the world opens up, revealing its beauty and bounty. You witness the changing seasons, the vibrant tapestry of nature unfolding before your eyes. The warmth of spring gives way to the lazy days of summer, followed by the golden hues of autumn and the quiet snows of winter. Through it all, you remain steadfast, your determination a constant companion. You encounter people from distant lands, each interaction adding a new thread to the rich fabric of your life. You trade stories, laughter, and companionship, forging bonds that transcend the boundaries of language and custom. The kindness of strangers echoes in your heart, reminding you of the inherent goodness that resides in humanity. And as the journey continues, your perspective shifts. The hardships of the past become stepping stones, shaping you into the person you are meant to be. The scars of servitude fade, replaced by a profound appreciation for the gift of freedom. The road, once a symbol of uncertainty, now represents the path of self-discovery and empowerment. With each passing day, you feel the shackles of your past fall away, replaced by the soaring spirit of independence. The world, once confined to the walls of your former life, now stretches endlessly before you, brimming with possibilities. You carry with you the lessons learned on the road, the values of resilience, hope, and compassion. You understand that life's journey is not merely about the destination, but about the transformative power of the road itself. As you continue your journey, you know that the road may sometimes be challenging, but your strength and determination will see you through. The vastness of the world beckons, promising adventures, challenges, and the fulfillment of dreams. With each step, you embrace the unknown, knowing that you possess the resilience and wisdom to navigate whatever lies ahead. The road is your teacher, the world your canvas, and you, the masterpiece in progress, forever shaped by the journey. The exact moment when life began for this child was unremarkable. In fact, nobody even noticed. They were born amidst the soft murmur of activity that never ceased within the walls of a Roman domus, household where life unfolded in a continuous cycle of work and rest. It was another day in the life of a Roman slave, which means it was just a normal day. This small dwelling, a fragment of a grander estate, consisted of several rooms opening off a central courtyard. Stone floors were cool beneath bare feet, though the flickering lamplight did little to chase away the pervasive gloom. The smell of clay lamps mingled with the aroma of warm bread rising in the kitchen, creating a strangely comforting blend of scents. Here in the atrium, sunlight streamed through an opening in the roof, illuminating motes dancing in the air. A gentle breeze carried the sound of birdsong from the garden outside, a tantalizing reminder of the world beyond these four walls. In the corner, a woman stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. She was a slave, as were all who resided within this house, including the infant now nestled against her, their tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Her name was Amara, but she had been so for only a few years. Like most slaves, she had been acquired at a young age and had no memory of the life before her servitude. The master, his wife, had taken a liking to her, and in a rare moment of magnanimity had bestowed upon her a name. However, the other slaves continued to call her Mara, a term of endearment that had evolved into something akin to a real name. It didn't matter anyway. Names were luxuries afforded to free people. For a slave, their worth was determined by their usefulness, nothing more. Mara had been born into chains, as would be the case for this child too. There were no wooden toys or brightly colored dolls for them to play with, no stories read aloud by a mother with a soothing voice. Their first lullaby would be the gentle susurrus of linen wraps being prepared, their cradle a basket lined with scraps of cloth. As they grew, they would watch the other children brought to the atrium by their nursemaids. Some were the legitimate heirs of the family, their futures mapped out in advance to secure advantageous political alliances or prosperous business partnerships. Others were the children of freed slaves, their fates less certain but still filled with promise. Freeborn Roman children would have been reciting rhetoric while playing in the garden, dreaming of the day when they would hold influential positions of power. The rhythmic slap of sandals against marble, the clatter of pottery as the water boy refilled the basins, and the murmured banter of the women preparing the midday meal created a familiar backdrop to the child's earliest memories. They learned to walk in the echoing vastness of the atrium, their tiny legs unsteady on the smooth, polished floors. They would stop on their way to the kitchen, helping their mother gather herbs from the window boxes that lined the courtyard. Even at this tender age, they understood their place. When their father returned from the forum, he would find his tools waiting, ready for him to continue his work. And one day the child would do the same, anticipating their father's needs before he even entered the atrium. This was the rhythm of their lives. Each day blurred into the next, a steady, predictable routine that governed every aspect of their existence. At night, after the lamp oil had been carefully rationed and the embers of the hearth had died down, the family would gather in the only space that offered some semblance of privacy. Huddled together for warmth, the child listened intently as their parents spoke and hushed. Tones about the events of the day or traded news with other families who shared their dwelling. It was here in the darkness that the parents would tell stories of a different kind. Tales of bravery and hope passed down from generation to generation, tales that sustained them through the harshest days. As the child grew older, their curiosity about the world outside their courtyard grew as well. Questions tumbled out of their mouth, innocent and untainted by the jaded outlook that life as a slave had forced upon their parents. Where does the sun go at night? What are those sounds in the garden? Why can't we go outside? Each question was met with a gentle but firm reminder that their place was here, inside the protective, albeit suffocating confines of their master's home. Their parents would speak not just of the dangers that lurked outside, but of the futility of dreaming beyond the walls of their servitude. Yet the child couldn't help but gaze at the sliver of moon peeking through the window, wondering what wonders might lie hidden in the star-dusted expanse of the night sky, while the child toiled in the fields, tending to the crops that would never nourish them. They would occasionally come across artifacts left behind by passing travelers: a broken shard of pottery, a worn leather sandal, a chipped marble statue. Each object became a tangible link to a world they knew nothing about, a world that existed outside their own. The child would bring these treasures back to their parents, their eyes shining with excitement. Together, they would piece together the stories of these objects, imagining the lives they once touched. The child clung to these moments, finding solace in the shared narratives they wove around each artifact, for it allowed them to dream, however briefly, of a life different from their own. One evening, as the family ate their simple supper, the child's gaze fell upon an old woman sitting nearby. Her wrinkled face and stooped shoulders told silent tales of a life well lived, yet her eyes twinkled with an ageless wisdom. Gathering their courage, the child asked, "How did you become wise?" The old woman looked at them for a long moment before answering softly by listening. Intrigued, the child pressed, "Listening to what?" The old woman smiled. "To the rhythm of life," she said, her voice raspy but kind. "It's in the rhythm that you find the stories, the joys, the sorrows, the everything that makes us human." And as the child listened to the gentle cadence of their life, they realized that perhaps their story wasn't so different from the others after all. Maybe they too had something valuable to say. Back in the shadows of the atrium, the child slept, their breaths soft and even. The rhythmic creak of the aging wooden floorboards lulled them into a peaceful slumber. A gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of night-blooming jasmine through the open window, mingling with the faint aroma of wood smoke and baking bread. The sound of crickets chirping in the darkness was a constant serenade, punctuated by the distant, melodic calls of night birds. In the farmyard, a dog barked, its sound echoing through the stillness. The child turned in their sleep, their tiny hands clenched tight, as if clutching onto a dream that was just out of reach. Beside them, their parents slept, their faces etched with the weariness of a life lived under the relentless sun. The mother's hand rested protectively on the child's shoulder, silent vow passing between them, a promise to shield their child from the harsh realities of their existence for as long as they could. The child's dreams were filled with images that danced just out of reach, like fragments of a world calling out with soft whispers. In these nighttime fantasies, they felt a deep longing, a craving for something they couldn't quite touch, like the fading notes of a forgotten song. These dreamy moments were both precious and almost painful, as they stirred up a bittersweet desire for a life that always felt just beyond their grasp. Trapped within the four walls of their home, the child's days were marked by the sun's rise and fall, while the nights were alive with the soothing sounds of crickets. Every sight, sound, and smell became part of their reality, woven into the very essence of who they were. The cool stone under their feet, the gentle sway of branches outside the window, and the warm scent of bread baking in the hearth all wrapped around them like a comforting lullaby, leading them to a peaceful acceptance of their life. And as the years rolled on, this rhythm of existence continued, shaping their story in ways they were yet to understand. The rhythm of their lives went on, a true testament to the unbreakable spirit of humanity, shining even in the darkest times. The first fingers of dawn were just beginning to touch the eastern hills when he was up. It swept the atrium twice already, muttering prayers to the household gods that it might go quickly and quietly, hoping that today would somehow be different. But even before the other slaves began stirring in their shadowy corners, he knew that it wouldn't be. His sandals slapped against the stone floor, the bronze bracelets on his wrists clinking softly with each step. He knew the routine by heart. Sweep the atrium, light the fires in the cubiculum, prepare the mistress's bath, help the children dress, light the fires in the kitchen, prepare breakfast, feed the mistress's doves, gather the figs from the fig tree, water the courtyard, sweep the courtyard, gather wood, fetch oil, clean the latrines, comb the dogs, polish the mistress's silver, polish the master's sandals, prepare dinner, serve dinner, clear dinner, light the lamps, water the courtyard again, sweep the courtyard again, ready for bed, lock up, and then finally, after the family had gone to bed, he could creep into his shadowed corner in the storage room and try to sleep. His ears ringing with the clatter of the kitchen and the mistress's laughter, his eyes squeezed tight against the flickering image of the hearthlight. He'd been born a slave, and he would die a slave. Didn't know where he'd been born or why. But he did know that when the master had bought him at the slave market, he had been just a babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, too young to remember anything. So the villa was his world, and its people were his gods. He didn't know what the world outside the villa walls was like, and to be honest, he didn't care. This was all he'd ever known, and all he'd ever need. The mistress called him Pure, which meant boy in Latin. He didn't know if he'd ever had a real name, one that his mother had crooned over him when he was a babe, but he didn't care about that either. Master never called him anything. To the master, he was just another possession, something to be used when needed and ignored otherwise. Sometimes he looked at his own hands, wondering what they had made before they had made his life here in the villa. He wondered if they had held a sword or a shield, had fought in the wars with the master, had labored in the fields as a farmer, or maybe had worked in the silver mines. Had they once been free? Did they have a family somewhere? Did someone out there in the world miss them? Or had they always been a slave, born into slavery, destined to die in slavery? But the questions brought no answers, only frustration, and so he pushed the thoughts away and got on with his work. The mistress liked her baths hot and fragrant. She would soak for hours sometimes, talking about this and that, about her friends, her parties, the latest gossip. He had learned long ago to ignore her. His job was to draw the bath, light the lamps, make sure that everything she needed was within reach, and then leave. But sometimes her voice would rise in pitch, and he couldn't help himself. He'd stand at the door listening, wondering what it would be like to have a voice that rang with power. A voice that could command, a voice that didn't have to stay hushed in dark corners. But that wasn't his place, so he went back to scrubbing the bath. The water was cold today. He splashed some in his hand, letting it trickle through his fingers, watching it splash onto the marble floor. It was hard to believe that anyone could live outside these four walls. Outside, there was the sun and the moon and the stars, wind and rain and snow, grasshoppers and crickets, and the warmth of a fire on a winter night. But it was impossible to imagine. He'd never seen the snow, never heard the crickets. For him, the world was the villa, the garden. The road that ran past the front gate, the market where he went to buy supplies, and the faces of the people he met along the way. The baker with his flour-dusted apron, the old woman selling fruit. The butcher wiping his hands on his bloody apron, the money changer counting his coins, the slave trader leading a chained man away. That was the world he knew. Lunch was bread and olives. It was the same every day. He sat on a low stool by the wall and watched the family eat. They were noisy, boisterous, laughing, telling stories, arguing. They were alive. He wanted to be alive like that, but he didn't know how. Maybe if he wasn't a slave, if he had a name instead of being called Pure, if he had parents who loved him, if he wasn't constantly tired, hungry, thirsty, he could be alive. But he was a slave, and his life was to serve, to obey, to do what he was told. In the afternoon, he helped the mistress weed the garden. The sun beat down on his neck. His back ached. His legs burned with fatigue. He didn't dare stop. He didn't dare ask for rest. Kept stooping, pulling, throwing. His hands were brown and gnarled, like the roots of the fig tree under which they sat. The mistress hummed a tuneless song. Her face was pale, almost white, like the marble fountain in the courtyard. It was cooler in the shade of the fountain. He dipped his head, cupped his hands, drank. The water was sweet on his tongue. He closed his eyes, savoring the moment, wishing he could stay there forever. But the job wasn't done. He dried the water from his mouth, got up, and went back to weeding. Dinner was served late. The master was in a good mood tonight. He ate with his friends. They drank wine, they sang songs, they joked, they laughed. The mistress was quiet, sat with her chin on her hand, staring into space. He poured her a cup of wine, brought it to her. She took it without a word, her eyes still distant. He wondered if she ever thought about him, about the other slaves. Did she ever wonder if they had families, if they had dreams, if they had names? They slept in the storage room. Wasn't enough space in the rooms inside the house, so the slaves had made their beds in the shadows beneath the eaves, under the stairs, in the closets. It was dark and dank, but it was theirs. The flickering lamplight cast long shadows on the walls. As he lay there trying to sleep, he dreamed that he was running, and running, but he never got anywhere. The faces of his fellow slaves swam before his eyes. Some were young, some were old, some had been bought as children. Some had been born here at the villa, some remembered their former lives. Others didn't remember anything. They were all ghosts, shades moving silently through the villa, doing their work, staying out of sight. Their bodies were here, but their minds were elsewhere, or maybe they were empty, hollowed out by endless toil. He woke with a start. The others were stirring now, getting up, stretching, shaking off the sleep, slapping their bare arms and breasts, calling out to each other in hushed voices. In the darkness, he couldn't tell their faces apart, but he knew them all by heart. There was the girl with the missing ear, the boy who couldn't speak, the old woman who shuffled like an old dog, the one they called One Eye. There were new ones too, the ones who had come from the slave market, skinny and scared, wondering what their lives would be now. And there was the one who had arrived yesterday, who had spent the night curled up in a corner, who hadn't spoken a word all day, who hadn't eaten any of the bread and olives. One by one, they slipped out of the storage room, moving silently through the villa, their bare feet making no sound on the marble floors. By now, the first fingers of dawn were touching the eastern hills. He sighed, got up, stretched, shook off the sleep, slapped his bare arms and breasts, and joined the others, muttering a prayer that today might be different, but he knew it wouldn't. He put on his sandals, the leather straps scratched and scuffed, picked up his water jug, its clay jar stained and mended. With a dozen other jugs, they moved out into the morning light, the shadow of the villa falling behind them. And still the rhythm of their lives carried on. This is an account of one Tyro, a slave who lived in ancient Rome, and whose story is both extraordinary and utterly unremarkable, which means Tyro, which means teacher. And yet he never taught anyone anything. Instead, it was Tyro who learned things from others, though no one ever taught him. He taught himself. And that was how, at least according to legend, he became the most highly literate slave in all of ancient Rome. He was born into slavery around 110 BC, and so had no record made of his birth. When he was very young, his mother, a slave in the household of a Roman senator named Cicero, held him close as she rocked him gently and hummed a tuneless song while tending to her mistress's loom. He would nestle his head against her shoulder and listen to the rhythmic clatter of the shuttle as it passed through the warp of the linen cloth, weaving itself into the weft. And then, when he was old enough, she set him to work running errands for the other slaves and the mistress's daughters. And he would run the errands and do his chores and listen to the girls reciting poetry as they stitched their fine garments. They recited things from poets like Homer and Sappho, but Tyro's mother, even as she toiled at her loom, knew those verses off by heart. He heard her recite them too, and he would memorize them, along with everything else he heard during his many wanderings about the great house. And because this was a great house, there were always visitors. There were senators and consuls, generals and philosophers, orators and poets. And as Tyro grew older, Cicero himself took notice of him, not because he was an especially bright or quick-witted slave, but simply because he was unusually observant. He remembered everything he saw and heard, and could recall it perfectly if asked. Cicero therefore took him aside one day and taught him to read, sensing that Tiro could make good use of such an education. After all, Cicero was a lawyer and politician who liked to impress people with his voluminous correspondence. And to that end, he would dictate letters to his secretaries, letters on law and politics and philosophy, sometimes just about his domestic affairs, but he also enjoyed writing letters himself, many of them. So it came to pass that Tiro, after learning to read, also learned to write. Then, soon afterwards, he invented a kind of shorthand for recording Cicero's thoughts while he dictated, and thus became the master's favorite secretary and constant companion. For Cicero traveled everywhere, and Tiro went with him, attending him in his study, traveling with him on business or pleasure, accompanying him when he was invited to speak, listening while the crowds roared their approval. Sometimes he would stay behind in attendance when Cicero attended banquets, standing by the door as guests caroused and shouted and sang, and then later, when the revelry was done, walking silently behind the drunken Cicero as the master stumbled home. In fact, Cicero often said that he owed his life to Tiro because Tiro would walk on either side of him when he was alone in public, ready to shield his master's person with his own if need be. And Tiro never complained about his lot in life, although there were times when he might have been forgiven for doing so. Once, for instance, Cicero was performing in a theatrical competition in Athens and lost. The crowd jeered and hurled insults at him, and he ran off stage in tears. Only Tiro stayed by his side, comforting him and telling him it wasn't true, that he hadn't lost, that he had actually won. And Cicero believed him, if only for a moment, because he relied on Tiro, really, for everything. He trusted him with his innermost thoughts and most secret plans. He valued his discretion and his sharp intellect. And so it was that Tiro served him for 35 years, not for silver or brass, but for the crumbs of knowledge and power that fell from his master's table. He grew old serving Cicero, seeing Rome change around him, enduring the earthquakes and the civil wars, watching new masters come and go. Yet he never owned anything himself, never even received payment of his master's debts. And yet he was enriched beyond measure, having access to books and scrolls and letters from every corner of the empire. Sometimes Cicero left him in charge of his house and gardens, expecting him to attend to his slaves and slaves, making sure the food was cooked and the wine was uncorked, that the oil was fresh and the couches clean, and that guests were welcomed and cared for as befitted the most distinguished senator in Rome. There were times, too, when Cicero summoned him into his study in the middle of the night and insisted on reading aloud the latest letter he had received from his correspondent, because Tiro's calm, clear voice soothed him and helped him to think. Sometimes Cicero even permitted him to read aloud from his own books. He would do so, sitting at his master's right hand, while Cicero rested his chin on his fist and listened intently. Indeed, Cicero knew that Tiro could read any Greek or Roman author without a word of correction, and he trusted him so completely that when he needed a tutor for his young son, he turned to Tiro, who then tutored the boy secretly. Because Cicero didn't want anyone to know that his son was being instructed by a slave. But still, it was not all sunshine and roses for Tiro, because he endured the sneers of freeborn Romans and the jests of his fellow slaves. And though Cicero favored him over the rest of his slaves, some masters are crueler than others. And once Tiro was sold to a cruel woman named Atropata, who chained him up and forced him to endure the stings of venomous wasps and the bites of venomous snakes, until Cicero bought him back. Yet after that, he was treated no differently than before, for better or worse. It was Tiro who answered Cicero's call, when he was accused of extortion and murder in Athens, and hurried to defend himself. Tiro was there waiting for him, and he accompanied him back to Rome, where Cicero was acquitted of the charges and returned to political prominence. In fact, Tiro was so faithful and dependable that Cicero was able to keep working without interruption, writing his philosophical treatises and delivering his famous speeches, knowing that Tiro was taking care of everything else. And so it was that Tiro quietly, almost invisibly, wove himself into the fabric of ancient Rome and Cicero's life. But while he was forgotten by the masses, Cicero never forgot him. Not only did he give Tyro his freedom late in life, he did so without fanfare, probably releasing him with the simple stroke of a stylus across a papyrus scroll. For manumission records for this period of Roman history are spotty at best. There are virtually none for the years between 82 and 78 BC when Cicero was in exile. And so we don't know exactly when Tyro was freed. We only know that it happened sometime before Cicero's assassination in 43 BC. It may well have been that he died a slave, in fact, but at any rate he lived out whatever years he had left, freed or not, in the shadow of his master. After all, Cicero's surviving letters stopped abruptly after he left Athens in 60 BC. So perhaps Tyro continued to serve him in some capacity until his death, which is what makes Cicero's words so strange. You see, in one of his letters, Cicero wrote that Tyro was his teacher, though never a pupil of his. Then again, perhaps that was an equation only he could make. It is true, after all, that Tyro learned much from Cicero. But he also taught him valuable lessons about humility and patience and how to listen. And still, the rhythm of his life was shaped by service. Even when he was free, he probably worked as a scribe or secretary, just as he had while enslaved. And who knows? Maybe someone would have written down his story had he lived long enough to tell it, and they had found it worthy of recording. As it is, he is known to us only because of Cicero, who revered him as much as his fellow Romans despised him. Mosaic floors cool beneath bare feet, the air thick with perfume, walls and columns wreathed in gold leaf, the flickering light of torches dancing on surfaces smooth and polished. In the distance, the resonant chords of a lyre, the low murmur of conversation, the glint of jewels flashing like sunlight on water. It was always like this in the villas of the Roman elite. Within the atrium, where slaves cooked over charcoal braziers, within the peristyle, where they served wine from silver flagons at banquets of roast boar and spiced bread, within the bathhouse, where masters reclined on marble couches, while slaves heated their bathwater until it steamed. Every corner of the grand house showcased the same stark contrast. The daily grind of toil and sweat against the backdrop of indulgent ease and luxury. And yet there was a quiet dignity to it all, a quiet dignity that endured. It was a life I knew well. I was a slave, born into servitude and destined to die beneath the marble floors, within the shadow of the walls that echoed with laughter and song. For 3 generations, my people had toiled here. Our hands calloused from hauling stone, our backs bent from years of labor under the hot sun. My father was a quarryman, his skin leathery and scarred from a lifetime of wielding a hammer against unforgiving rock. My mother, she was a weaver, her fingers nimble despite their gnarled joints. They named me Demetrius when I was born, after the sun god, a cruel joke considering I would live a life without ever seeing the sunlight. The villa stretched out around us like a maze, its many rooms echoing with the footsteps of our masters and their guests. I knew every corridor, every fountain, every secret passageway, as intimately as the lines on my palm. Yet there were parts of the house I was forbidden to enter. The women's quarters, where silk curtains concealed private pleasures, the treasury, where chests overflowed with gold and precious gems, in the cubiculum. The bedroom of my mistress and her husband. There, behind the closed doors, were the hushed whispers of love and the sounds of passion. Occasionally the muffled cries of anger, then silence, the sound of fear. My mistress was beautiful, with skin like alabaster and hair the color of ripe wheat. She moved through the villa with the languid grace of a high-born woman, her every step purposeful. Her husband, he was different. Tall and corded with muscle, his face etched with the scars of battle, his eyes hard and sharp as a hawk's. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice was a rumble that shook the very foundations of the house. I saw the way he looked at my mistress, possessive and fierce, as if he feared someone might try to tear her away from him. But it was his gaze, cold and appraising, that sent shivers down my spine. Despite the heat that shimmered off the marble floors, I always wore a tunic, linen in summer, wool in winter. It was a garment meant to conceal rather than adorn. Its rough edges chafed against my skin. And when I bent to pick up something fallen, its hem rode up, exposing the dirt-ingrained grime beneath my fingernails. But I never complained. A slave's duty was to endure. My mistress, though, she had garments spun from gossamer threads, so light they seemed almost diaphanous. Her dresses rustled like autumn leaves as she moved. Once, while dusting the books in the library, I accidentally knocked over an overturned stool and it fell, crashing to the floor. I froze, expecting the sharp crack of my master's whip. Instead, my mistress let out a soft laugh. "Accidents happen, Demetrius," she said, reaching out to brush a strand of hair away from my face. "It is only a stool." Her touch was feather-light, yet it sent tremors through me. I managed a shaky smile, surprised by her kindness. Perhaps my mistress wasn't as cold as my master. We dined on the bounty of the villa, plump grapes plucked fresh from the vine, bread still warm from the oven, honey sweet enough to make the mouth water. The food was laid out on plates of fine porcelain and crystal goblets held the finest vintage. Each dish was a masterpiece of flavor and presentation. At the same time, just beyond the open windows, I could see the other slaves eating their meager portions of porridge and stale bread. We weren't allowed to eat with our masters, of course, we ate separately, our meals thrown to us as if we were dogs. Yet even in the midst of this splendor, there was an undercurrent of tension. My master's moods were as unpredictable as the winds. One moment he would roar with laughter, the next he would be silent and brooding. His silence was the worst. It was as suffocating as the midday heat, heavy and oppressive. It pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. Then the smallest misstep would set him off. A dropped tray of figs, a spilled goblet of wine, a slow serving at dinner, anything could provoke his ire. And when he was angry, his voice boomed through the villa like a clap of thunder. Fear coiled in my stomach, cold and tight. As night fell, casting long shadows across the villa, I helped carry in the flaming torches. Their light danced on the frescoed walls, illuminating scenes of gods and heroes. Sometimes the paintings were of slaves toiling in the fields or at their various tasks. I wondered if the artists who painted them ever thought, how do you capture the weight of a lash against flesh? How do you paint the sting of salt water mixing with blood? How do you show the exhaustion that etched deep lines on a young face? There were times when I yearned for my old life, for the freedom to walk barefoot through the dusty roads of my village, for the feel of grass beneath my fingertips, for the taste of wild berries plucked fresh from the bush. But those memories were fading, becoming as distant as the horizon. I tended to the gardens, coaxing life from the soil, watching as seeds sprouted into life, tended to the vines, pruned and trained them to climb the trellises. I sang as I worked, ancient songs my grandmother had taught me, songs of love and loss, of hope and despair. The melodies echoed in the stillness of the early morning or late afternoon, mingling with the buzz of insects and the coo of doves. When the evenings, after my day's work was done, I would sit on the edge of the fountain, its cool water soothing against my skin. Above me, the sky blazed with stars. I traced constellations, finding comfort in their eternal presence. Sometimes I made up stories about them, tales of gods and heroes, anything to keep the loneliness at bay. But even as the days turned into weeks and the seasons shifted, there were moments that stood out. Like the day a new slave arrived, a young woman with eyes full of fear and defiance. I saw myself in her, the hope that flickered in her eyes, the strength in her posture, the quiet dignity that shone through her ragged clothes. I knew she wouldn't stay that way for long. The villa would wear her down, just as it had worn me. Still, I offered her a small smile, a silent acknowledgement of the shared burden they would both now carry together. Then there was the gladiator. He arrived wounded, his body a tapestry of cuts and bruises, his spirit unbroken. I treated his wounds, cleaning and bandaging them, talking to him in hushed tones. He told me of battles and triumphs, of cheers that shook the Colosseum and the sting of defeat. When he left the villa to return to the games, I felt a twinge of fear for him, but also a surge of admiration. Finally, there was the painter. He was an artist, someone who saw beauty in the world and wanted to capture it on canvas. I watched him work, mesmerized by the way his brush danced across the surface, bringing his vision to life. I never understood art, not really, but I saw the passion in his eyes, the dedication in his movements, the joy in his creations. Maybe that was enough. One day, I stumbled upon a discarded piece of papyrus and a chipped clay brush. On a whim, I dipped the brush in a pot of leftover paint and traced a line, then another. It wasn't art, not really. It was just a mindless distraction. But for a moment I forgot where I was, what I was doing. I was just a person making marks on a piece of paper. It was a luxury I couldn't afford, this brief escape, this stolen moment of joy. And yet it was in these stolen moments, in the quiet dignity of enduring, that I found a strange sort of solace. Beneath the marble, amidst the shadows and echoes, I found myself. And from beneath the marble, the rhythm of their lives endured. The festival of Saturnalia had begun. For 4 days, the normal rules of roaming society would be suspended. For 4 days, the familiar sting of insults and lashes would not ring out in the taverns and gambling halls. For 4 days, the weight of watchful eyes and purses weighing down the purse would be forgotten. For 4 days, the bitter taste of fear would not darken the corners of their mouths. For 4 days, they could laugh. A slave might find himself suddenly addressed by his master by name, not Demetrius, but by his given name at birth, the one that was meant for him when he was a child. Before he was sold, before he was branded, before he became property, before he forgot it was even his name, he could feel the heat of the master's gaze upon him, not with the intent to assess his worth or his obedience, but with the intent to share a joke, a jest, a stolen glance over the rim of a goblet. He could meet that gaze and return the smile without fear, could speak up in the group of men, voice his opinion, tell a story, make a fool of himself. And for those brief moments, be accepted, welcomed, appreciated, loved. They all feasted like kings. Theirs were tables laden with food, not the scraps the masters tossed to them from their own feasts, but their own victuals, set out on their own table, laid out with care and affection. They sang and danced, the sound of their voices and laughter mingling with the strum of a guitar. Some drank until their bellies were full of wine. Some only pretended to drink, just enough to catch the eye of their master, who poured another goblet and smiled, or tried to smile, for they too were taking part in the folly of the feast, the madness of the merriment, and they did so with a strange, almost alien joy. Demetrius held the goblet in both hands, not caring that wine dribbled down his chin. Laughter bubbled up from his chest, shaking his whole body, making his eyes water. It was the kind of laughter that could only come from deep within a man, the kind that expressed everything he could not say, everything he could not do. At that moment, he was not a slave. At that moment, he was not property. At that moment, he was free. He had been a young boy when he was taken from Africa, barely more than a babe, really. His mother had carried him to the ship, cradled him in her arms, sung him songs to calm his crying, prayed to the gods to protect him, begged the gods to give his heart to her instead. He remembered clawing at her, scratching and biting, desperate to stay where she was. He remembered being ripped from her arms, remembered the chains that bit into his wrists, the shackles that pinned his ankles together. He remembered his howls of protest, his screams of pain. He remembered being dragged through the marketplace, people pointing, parents clutching their children close. He remembered seeing the look on his father's face, a mask of stoic calm, hiding the turmoil inside. He remembered the sting of betrayal, the searing bite of abandonment. And now here he was, laughing like a man possessed, tears streaming down his face, wine staining his beard, and not caring. This joy was a rare thing. It was a forbidden thing. It was dangerous to be happy when one was a slave, just as it was dangerous to love a woman when one was nothing but a nameless face in the crowd. For what a master could turn in his goblet and walk away never to return, a slave could turn from a favorite to a burden, could lose his position, lose his privileges, lose the favor that made him an object of derision rather than contempt. Such was life as a slave, as while they could. While the music played and the wine flowed and the goblets were filled again, they laughed and they sang. Some couples embraced, the woman's fingers tangled in the man's hair, the man's lips claiming hers, and for those few stolen moments, they were two souls meeting under the cloak of night. Two lovers seeking solace from the world's judgment, two hearts beating as one. Some were silent, simply watching the revelry around them, a half smile on their faces, their eyes distant, lost in memories of a time before. But when they looked around, when they saw the mirth, the merriment, the unrestrained abandon of others, when they heard the echoes of laughter, it brought back a flood of memories. They remembered the day they had woken up in this new life, remembering the dread that had filled them, remembering the uncertainty of what lay ahead, remembering the days of waiting, the nights of fear, the hopes that flickered and died, the dreams that were crushed underfoot. They remembered the taste of despair, the sting of humiliation, the burn of rage. They remembered the day they had woken up in this new life, remembering the dread that had filled them, remembering the uncertainty of what lay ahead, remembering the days of waiting, the nights of fear, the hopes that flickered and died, the dreams that were crushed underfoot. They remembered the taste of despair, the sting of humiliation, the burn of rage. It was all so fresh in their minds, so vivid and sharp that it seemed to have happened yesterday. And yet it had been years ago, years of misery, years of sorrow, years of silent rebellion. Some watched, too, the masters among them, the same masters who ruled with an iron fist, who cracked whips, who doled out punishments, who looked upon slaves as nothing more than objects, things to be bought and sold. They watched their slaves and smiled. They saw the joy on their faces, the mirth in their eyes, the abandon in their laughter, and they felt a warmth spread through them, a feeling that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. It was a feeling they had long forgotten, a feeling they had never known. And they knew, as the slaves knew, that this was only a reprieve. A brief pause in the madness of life, a stolen moment of happiness. They knew, as the slaves knew, that tomorrow the whip would crack again, that tomorrow the insults would sting, that tomorrow the fear would return. They knew, as the slaves knew, that the night would end, and with it this strange interlude of joy. And still, as long as the night lasted, as long as the laughter echoed through the taverns, as long as the wine flowed and the goblets were raised, they pretended. The masters pretended to be equals, serving wine to their slaves, letting them pass by without a second glance, sharing a smile, sharing a word. The slaves pretended to be free, running through the streets, singing at the top of their lungs, embracing the women they loved, kissing the children who were theirs. But they knew, the masters and the slaves, that with the first light of dawn, the charade would end. They knew that the world would spin back on its axis, that the sun would rise and set as it always did, that the wheel of life would turn and grind them into its gears. They knew that soon, very soon, they would wake up and remember. Still, as long as the night lasted, as long as the laughter echoed through the taverns, as long as the wine flowed and the goblets were raised, they pretended. For in pretending, they found a measure of truth, a sliver of hope, a taste of freedom. The night wore on, the crowds grew thinner, the laughter grew louder, the wine grew stronger. The drums beat slower, the garlands fell away, the laughter faded, and the rhythm of their lives returned. His body is weaker now, older, slower. The muscles that were once hard and strong are going soft and shriveled like a grape left too long in the sun. He does not work as hard anymore. His master has given him lighter tasks, but he still works, even if no one notices it. No one remembers. Even his own name has slipped from the memories of man and beast. He is an old slave. His master's son runs the fields now, keeping the soil healthy and the crops strong. The boy is quick and light on his feet, and he takes pride in his strength and speed. Sometimes when the boy runs past, he can hear the wind whistling through his hair, just like the wind that used to whip through his own hair when he was young. Back when he ran these very same paths, the same dust rising around his feet, he was just as proud, just as full of life. But that was another lifetime ago. He feels the ache in his bones when the sun dips low in the sky and the shadows grow long. That soon he too will be nothing but dust and bone. There are times when the old slave dreams of freedom, dreams of being out there in the open field with the wind whipping through his hair, running towards the sunset. But when he wakes from those dreams, he finds himself back in his corner, surrounded by the familiar four walls that have been his only company for so many years. Sometimes his master will come into the room and stand over him. The old slave knows what the master is thinking. Sometimes his master will ask him a question. Sometimes it's about the weather. Sometimes it's about the crops. Sometimes it's about nothing at all. The old slave doesn't mind. He likes the sound of his master's voice, even if he doesn't understand most of the words. It reminds him of a time when he had a master's voice telling him what to do, guiding him, protecting him. Back when he was young and strong, when he could feel the strength in his arms and the sun on his shoulders, he was more than a slave, was a part of something bigger than himself. but now he is old and weak. Sometimes his master will tell him how lucky he is to be free of his chains, free to live out his last years in peace, free to die. But some days the old slave longs for the chains. If he had been chained up, someone would have cared enough to make sure he did not starve. Someone would have cared enough to make sure he had a warm place to sleep. Someone would have cared enough to make sure he died with dignity. Instead, he is free. He is alone. The cold nights are the worst. When the temperature drops and the wind blows through the cracks in the walls, he shivers. But he will not ask for more blankets. His master will think he is lazy. He will think the old slave is trying to get out of working the next day, so he suffers in silence, pulling his thin blanket around him like a shield against the night. He remembers a time when he had a wife. She was beautiful. Her skin was smooth and brown like polished leather. Her eyes sparkled like polished amber. They met at a festival, dancing under the pale glow of the harvest moon. He was just a young slave then, barely more than a boy himself. But she had seen something in him, something worth loving. They danced until the stars turned cold and the moon dipped low in the sky. And then they made love under the old oak tree. Its branches heavy with ripe fruit, heavy with the promise of new life. He felt like a god when she looked at him with adoring eyes. Back then, he had dreamed of one day owning that oak tree, planting his own vines beneath its shade and making wine as sweet and enduring as her smile. But it was just a dream. A slave can dream, but a slave cannot own. Now, he sleeps alone in his cold, dark room. Sometimes the rats creep into his bed and snuggle up to his thin blanket. In the daytime, he watches the families walking through the marketplace. He watches children chasing pigeons in the square. He sees young lovers holding hands under the shade of the oak tree, sees strong young men haggling over the price of grain. He watches them all, and he remembers. There were times when he walked these very streets, when he chased pigeons in this very square, when he bargained for grain in this very market. Once, his master had planned to sell him to the slavers in the south. The journey would take weeks, maybe months. So the master let him walk behind the wagon, rest whenever he wanted, eat from the scraps dropped by the travelers. For the first time, the old slave saw other parts of the world beyond his master's fields. He saw rivers wider than the road itself. He watched birds that soared higher than the tallest trees. He saw mountains that seemed to touch the clouds. He saw snow for the first time, sparkling on the ground like scattered diamonds. He picked up a handful and let it melt in his palm, amazed by the cold fire that flowed between his fingers. In Rome, the slavers kept him chained up in a dank, dark room, waiting for a buyer. He spent long nights listening to the sounds of the city, the murmur of voices, the rumble of carts, the laughter of young men, the cries of street vendors, the distant music of street performers. One night, the room filled with smoke. He coughed, choking on the acrid air, and a guard came in to break the chain around his neck. The guard dragged him through the smoky streets, past shops and houses, down narrow alleys and across rickety bridges. Finally, they reached a large building with peeling paint and a crumbling roof. This is where the condemned are brought before they are thrown to the lions. The old slave looked up at the crumbling roof, wondering if he would see the sun again. But after a while, the guard unlocked his chains and left him alone in the smoky room. Later that night, he found a loose stone in the corner and used it to smash the window latch. The glass shattered, sending shards raining down around him. He pushed through the opening and slipped out into the night. He was free. For many years, he lived as a beggar, surviving on the generosity of the kind-hearted. The spare change tossed his way by well-meaning Romans. He slept in doorways, sought shelter under bridges, begged for food at the temples. Sometimes people recognized him. They called out his name, shaking their heads in disbelief. Once in a while, someone offered him a coin or a crust of bread, but most just turned away. As the years passed, his body grew weaker. He felt the sun beating down on his shoulders and the winter winds gnawing at his bones. One day his legs gave way, and he fell to his knees in the middle of the marketplace. As he lay there looking up at the sun, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He was free, was truly free. One evening, the old slave stopped begging at the temple, and no one noticed. No one knew that the old slave had breathed his last breath on the cold stone steps, unnoticed, unmourned. If he had a funeral, it would be small and simple. The priest would say a few words over his grave, sprinkle it with holy water, and walk away. Maybe a passerby would drop a coin into the donation box, or maybe they wouldn't. Maybe his grave would have a simple inscription, "Here lies a nameless soul," or maybe it would have no marker at all. He is just another nameless face in the crowd, another story lost to the sands of time. His name is gone, his glory is gone, his deeds are forgotten. But as the sun sets over the horizon and the shadows grow long, he remembers. He remembers who he was, what he did, where he went, who he loved. And in silence, the rhythm of their lives faded away. What remains to us of the life of a Roman slave? They lived in quarters close to the villas of their masters, sometimes separated only by a wall. We know that from the excavations at Pompeii, where entire neighborhoods were unearthed, filled with the objects of everyday life. We know that men, women, and children worked alongside one another, sharing tools and gossip, eating at the same tables. But what do we really know about them? What do the ruins tell us about them? There are the foundations of their houses, empty rooms without walls or roofs, rooms divided by curtains instead of doors, tiny windows. Looking out onto a courtyard, where a fountain played and fruit trees grew silent now, just like the people who lived there. There are the bronze tools they used in their work, heavy sickles and pruning knives, shards of pottery, lamps made from a single piece of clay. And then there are the bones, silent too, except for what they reveal to us when scientists examine them. Some bones are broken, deformed. Others are missing. Bones tell us of illnesses, of punishments inflicted and received. They also tell us that some slaves died young and some lived to an advanced age. We also have inscriptions left by the very people who owned them, master to his property. This villa belonged to Marcus Lucretius Fronto. Marcus was the master and Fronto was the name of the property itself, of the building, of the land, of everything that was his. It wasn't unusual for a property to have its own name. You almost feel like it's alive, don't you? Like this is the way it is. Marcus, how many slaves did you own? How many of them bore the same name as your house? Who were they? Men or women? Did they live here or did they travel with you? Did they have families? How many generations of Fronto slaves are buried under the soil of this very place? Will we ever find them? Here's a fragment of marble bearing a short epitaph. It reads, "At this place lies the body of Publius, son of Priscus. Born on the 17th day before the calends of August, he died on the 14th day before the calends of December. He was 31 years old. Who was Publius? A slave or a freedman? The inscription doesn't say. But it tells us that even a slave could receive a funeral, right? Reserved for the most important Romans. Even a slave could earn the right to rest in peace. We don't know anything about his life, about what he did during those 31 years, yet we can imagine him going about his daily routine. We see him entering and exiting a door with the food basket slung over his arm, perhaps coming back from the market walking down a street, dodging pedestrians and carts, or waiting patiently while his master handles official business. The image of Publius comes to life before our eyes, but he's always a step away, like smoke, like a whisper, like a dream. We can almost touch him, but he's gone the moment we try. Now, here's an object discovered in Pompeii. Archaeologists found it buried in the ruins of a house destroyed by the eruption. It's a small statue made from terracotta, less than 10 inches tall. The statue dates back to the late 3rd century BCE, so it was already 200 years old at the time of the eruption. It was probably part of a collection passed down from father to son. Slaves didn't own things, but sometimes they were given things. Sometimes they received gifts, like a child might get a toy on a holiday, or for good behavior. Who were the slaves who built the roads that connected the provinces of the empire? Who were the slaves who built the temples of Jupiter and Juno? And who built the house where an old woman named Cornelia kept her precious collection of terracotta statues? Where are the echoes of their lives? When the excavators removed the debris of pumice and lava, they uncovered roads in perfect condition. It's paved with stone and lined with rows of perfectly preserved milestones marking the distance to faraway cities. Uncovered temples with marble columns and gilded chariots ready to be sacrificed. They found houses with frescoed walls depicting scenes from mythology and with mosaics depicting battles between Greeks and Persians. All these treasures bear witness to the genius of the Roman world. But none of them bears witness to the fact that they were built by slaves, by men and women whose names have been lost to the sands of time. Have you ever wondered why the Colosseum is called the Colosseum and not the Flavian Amphitheater? Because that was its original name. It was given by Emperor Vespasian, who was responsible for completing its construction after the fire set by the disgruntled gladiator Spartacus. Do you know who Spartacus was? A Thracian slave who revolted against Rome? One historian wrote that he led an army of 120,000 slaves. Can you imagine? They marched on Rome, but they were defeated near the town of Saticula. The historian wrote that Spartacus died fighting, but we don't know if he did or if he managed to escape. We don't know if he crossed the sea and settled in the east, where legends say that he became king. How many roads did you walk along today? How many shops did you pass on your way here? How many monuments did you stop to admire? How many pieces of ancient sculpture did you take pictures in front of? Everything you see around you, everything you've seen all day, it's the result of slave labor. Roads, shops, monuments, temples, everything is the result of slave labor. Behind every great construction project, there's an invisible force that brings it to life, an invisible force that's never spoken of, but without which nothing would be possible. That invisible force is human labor. And the slaves were the ones who brought the whole of Rome to life. They cut wood in the forests of northern Africa and transported it on ships to be used in the construction of public buildings and private homes. They mined marble in the quarries of Greece and dragged it across the Aegean Sea to decorate the palaces of the emperors. They quarried the precious Egyptian granite and built the obelisks that still stand in the squares of Rome and Alexandria. They were experts in every trade, superior to the so-called free artisans because they knew their craft better. Because they had learned it from an early age, often from their parents, who had been slaves too. They handed down their knowledge from one generation to the next, keeping alive traditions and techniques that otherwise would have been lost forever. We know that the great Domos Trans Tiberum, the largest complex of buildings ever constructed, took 18 months to complete. We know that it required the work of thousands of slaves, but we don't know their names. Their labor was considered priceless, yet it cost nothing. The labor of the slaves was the grease that lubricated the wheels of the Roman machine, allowing it to turn smoothly and make progress. Without them, the machine would have ground to a halt. The emperor would not have been able to parade around the forum. The merchant would not have been able to grow his fortune. The senator would not have had time to indulge in politics. The gladiator would not have been able to fight in the arena. It was the slaves who paid the price for everything to function. It was the slaves who made it possible. Their story is told in the very stones that the Romans used to build their towers. Towers that pierced the sky, pyramids, towers, tombs, entire cities. In the Middle Ages, the stones of Pompeii were used to build the fortress of the neighboring city of Naples. Today, tourists visit the very fortress that once stood guard over the enslaved people of Pompeii. They walk along the streets of Ostia Antica, the port city of Rome, and don't realize that the stones beneath their feet were once moved by slaves. They marvel at the Colosseum, the Pantheon, the aqueducts, the arches, the forums. And do not realize that the stones of the mighty Rome were once carried by hands that were considered worthless? Where are the echoes of their lives? Are they sleeping under the soil of this place? Are they beneath our feet? Do they live on in the rhythm of the city? When you walk through the center of Rome, listen carefully. Can you hear the sound of hammers on stone, the creak of pulleys, the scrape of chisels? Can you hear the murmur of voices speaking different languages, the clash of wills, the pounding of muscles, the pain of a whiplash? Listen closely. Can you hear the echo of a hoe digging into the earth? Can you hear the slaves singing as they harvest the grapes in the vineyards of southern Italy, the wheat fields of Egypt, the olive groves of Greece? Listen well, and you'll hear the answer. It's the answer to the question of what remains to us of the life of a Roman slave. And still today, the rhythm of their lives whispers through stone. Thank you for watching. A young boy sat cross-legged on a stool beside an older man who sat cross-legged on a low stool. The old man was weaving at a loom. His hands moved steadily, expertly threading the shuttle through the warp. The boy watched intently, copying the old man's every move. When the old man paused to take a drink from a gourd hanging on his belt, the boy picked up the shuttle and attempted to thread it through the weights without success. When the old man returned to his work, he reached out and took the shuttle from the boy, guiding the boy's hand as he threaded the weight. The old man repeated this several times until the boy could thread the weight unaided. But even after much practice, The boy's movements were slow and stiff compared to the old man's. "Now get up and stretch your legs," the old man said. "Then come back and sit down and let me show you how to make the cloth neater." After showing the boy several times, the old man stopped. "Now do it yourself," he said, pointing to a weighted bar sticking out from the side of the loom. The boy reached out and started beating the cloth, making it neat. From the time they were very young, slaves were given tasks appropriate for their age that they had to perform each day. Some were taught to cook, others to write, some to weave or to mend, while others were taught to work in the stables, no matter what they were taught. Every slave had to learn obedience and the ability to perform their duties without complaint or question. They learned this through constant repetition of their assigned tasks. And they learned the most important lesson of all, that their masters had the right to punish them if they did not obey. This was the foundation of the entire system under which they lived. In the early morning hours, before other sounds filled the air, the sound of a hammer on an anvil rang out over the plantation. Soon, the sounds of sawing, chopping, and hammering joined the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith. In the fields, the muffled thud of a hoe hitting packed earth rose and fell like the tide. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the day filled with the buzz of insects, the calls of birds, the shouts of overseers, and the creak of wagons on gravel. There were many sounds that filled a slave's ears every day, but the sound of a tool was the most important, was the sound of their life. The boy's master often worked in the smithy. From the time the boy could walk, he had followed his master into the shop and watched him heat iron and steel. One day the master gave the boy a small piece of metal and told him to hit it with a hammer. Of course, the boy didn't know how to hit the metal just yet, so he just swung the hammer as hard as he could, making sparks fly. "Don't hit like that," the master said. "Show me how you heard me tellin' the iron to bend." So the master took the metal, and with a few wee-lamed hammer blows, bent it into a hook shape. Then he handed the hammer back to the boy. "Now do it," he said. Again, the master showed the boy how to hold the hammer and how to direct the first blow to heat the iron, then the second to bend it. He repeated this until the boy could make the hook by himself. Even when they were very young, slaves were expected to work. Sometimes they would watch other slaves working and copy their every move. They learned this way without being told. Even if they made mistakes, no one would say anything. If the master noticed, he would correct the slave with a sharp word or a sharp cut from his whip. Slaves tried not to make mistakes. They knew their master might punish them for a mistake that wasn't intentional. But they also knew that a punishment for a mistake that was intentional could be much worse. They learned to move with a kind of stiff grace, to speak with a kind of slow reverence. Every movement, every word had to be careful. If they weren't careful, someone else would be punished. Not only did the slave have to learn his trade, he had to learn the rules of his life. Sometimes a master would stop what he was doing and look at the work one of his slaves was doing and say, "That's good," and the slave would go on working, taking pride in his master's praise. Most of the time, though, there was no reward for a job well done. If a slave was praised for something he did, it was only because he was doing what he was supposed to do. There was no other reason for the praise. If a slave wasn't praised for doing something, it didn't mean he did a bad job. It meant that his master expected him to do that kind of work without praise or thanks. For a slave, the only reward for good work was knowing that his master was pleased with him, and that was reward enough. Masters often took great pride in the skills of their slaves, especially those who worked in the house. Since these slaves worked in close proximity to the family, their skills reflected on the family. A cook had to learn many dishes and how to prepare them properly. A seamstress had to learn how to sew and mend clothing and how to keep it in good repair. A stable hand had to know how to care for horses and other livestock, how to train them and drive them. Each of these slaves had to learn their trade inside out, backwards and forwards, and they had to do it quickly and quietly. Some people might think that learning a trade is easy, but it isn't. It takes patience and understanding. You have to be able to listen to instructions and follow them. You have to be able to understand the reasons behind the instructions and why they are important. When you learn a trade, you don't just learn the steps, you learn the reasons for the steps. In order to master a trade, you have to live it, breathe it, dream it. When a slave learned a trade, he didn't just learn a trade, he learned a way of life. And this way of life was the only thing that separated him from his master. One day the old man stopped weaving and beckoned to the boy. "Come here," he said. The boy went over to where the old man sat. The old man indicated that the boy should sit down next to him. "Sit like this," the old man said. The boy awkwardly shifted his position so that he was sitting with his legs crossed like the old man. "See that I showed you?" the old man said, pointing to his hands. The boy looked at the old man's hands. They were gnarled and twisted with age, but they moved with a kind of grace that the boy had never seen before. The old man's hands had learned a trade. They knew what to do long before his brain told them what to do. It was almost like the hands had a mind of their own, like they could think and act without needing his brain to tell them what to do. As the boy watched his master work, he learned not just how to weave, but how to be a weaver. He learned the feel of the loom beneath his fingers, the sound of the shuttle in the loom, the smell of the wool in the air. He learned how to make the cloth neater, how to read the pattern, how to adjust the tension on the loom. He learned all of this without being told, without asking, without complaining. He simply observed, copied, and listened. And slowly, very slowly, he became a weaver too. Most slaves learn their trade by watching others and copying their every move. They would start by doing the easiest parts of the job, like handing tools to their master or fetching materials for him. As they got older, they would take on more and more responsibility until they were doing the entire job themselves. Some slaves learned their trade by being taught directly by their master. This usually happened when the master had a moment to spare and the slave was old enough to grasp what was being taught. More often than not, though, another slave would step in to teach. This would happen when the master needed to get back to work, and there was no one else available. Most of the time, teaching happened quietly and without any fuss. One slave would simply guide another on what to do, and the other would follow along. There were no formal lessons, no lectures, and definitely no demonstrations. The slave was expected to pick up the trade by osmosis. This was usually a slow process, but it was effective. By the end of it, the slave knew his trade as well as the person who taught it to him. Learning a trade as a slave wasn't easy. It required a lot of patience and understanding, but the rewards were great. The slave who mastered his trade earned the respect of his peers and admiration from his master. For a slave, that recognition was everything. Skill became a natural part of their daily lives, woven into the very fabric of their existence. They walked out into the open air, blinking against the brightness, squinting at the sun, as if seeing it for the first time. Behind them, the heavy wooden door creaked shut. Outside, people were going about their business. Merchants hawked their wares. Pedestrians hurried along the crowded street. To the newly freed, all of that was distant, muted. Their ears were ringing. The years of silence had been so profound that now the very sounds of freedom seemed too loud, too sharp. In the bustling city of Rome, life was slowly returning to the sounds it had been before the plague. But for the formerly enslaved, the sounds of freedom were different. It was the scrape of a cart on cobblestones, the clank of metal tools, the shout of a vendor calling out his wares, the murmur of voices raised in anger or laughter. And in the midst of it all, the steady clip-clop of sandals on stone. They didn't dare hurry, not yet. Each step was tentative, unsure, as if they feared the ground might swallow them whole. Manumission. That was how they came to be free. They'd been bought out of slavery, earned their freedom, or been given it as a gift. By law, they were now officially free men and women, Roman citizens with all the rights and privileges that came with it. They could vote, own property, make contracts, testify in court. In theory, they were equal before the law, equal to any other freeborn Roman, but in practice, they remained where they had been before. Their newfound freedom did little to alter their way of life. Most of them, would continue to work for their former masters, not because they had to, but because they knew no other way of life. Now that they were free, they could leave, find other work elsewhere. But where would they go? What would they do? All they really knew was the work they'd been forced to do as slaves. For so many, the thought of leaving their masters empty-handed was unthinkable. Besides, they were needed. Their masters needed them. How would the household manage without them? And their masters, despite the inconvenience of having to pay them for their work, also depended on their former slaves. After all, where else would they find workers who knew every nook and cranny of the house, who knew what needed to be done before it was even asked for? Where else would they find such loyalty, such discretion? There were others, of course, freeborn Romans, who would work for money. But those people were motivated by self-interest. They did things because they were paid to do them. Former slaves, on the other hand, continued to work out of a sense of duty, out of loyalty born from years of coercion and fear. Being freed wasn't like walking away from a wound that had finally begun to heal. It was like taking a hot coal and pressing it to your chest, hoping it would burn its way through. For some, manumission was a death sentence. As the years passed, more and more former slaves died, not because they were mistreated or overworked, but simply of old age. To their masters, this presented a problem. They couldn't replace the experience, the knowledge their aging slaves possessed. So many of them turned to adoption, taking in young captives from the most recent batch of plunder and training them up in the ways of the household. With the younger slaves, there was more leeway, more opportunity to shape them in their image. Some of the older slaves were allowed to teach the newest captives their trade. This gave the older ones a sense of purpose, something to do in their final years. Besides, it was easier to keep an eye on someone when they were working. If nothing else, it kept them busy. But being free wasn't just about working for your former master. Being free meant taxes. Yes, even as a former slave, you had to pay your taxes. Oh sure, your master might have paid them for you in the past, but now that you were free, it was your responsibility. And that meant setting aside a portion of your wages every month, every year, depending on how much you made, to give to the imperial treasury. It wasn't much, but it was enough to chafe at times, enough to make a former slave long for the simplicity of slavery. Taxes were one thing. Patron loyalty was another. Many freedmen and freedwomen remained loyal to their former patrons, acting as though they were still bound to them by the chains of slavery. They attended the patron's parties, greeted him warmly when they saw him, even went out of their way to please him. In the eyes of the world, they were free. But in the eyes of their former masters, they were still property. Some freedmen and freedwomen chose to honor their former masters even after death. When a patron died, freedmen were expected to don the traditional garb of mourning and follow behind the funeral procession, quietly weeping, throwing dust on their head. They did this not because they were still bound to their former masters, but because they knew it was expected of them. Because to show disrespect to a dead Roman, even one who had been cruel, was tantamount to committing a crime. Others used their freedom in small ways. They started to dress differently, more like the freeborn Romans around them. Instead of the rough tunics and practical sandals, they donned finer garments, brighter jewelry, more fitting footwear. And then there were those who took advantage of their newfound freedom to take on new names. Names like Servus, Anicetus, or Marcus, names taken from their favorite Roman heroes or gods. For a former slave, choosing a name was an important decision. Most retained their original names, usually with the addition of the name of the god they were supposedly dedicated to. But some preferred to cut all ties with their old life, even the memories of it. Some chose names that sounded like the names of freeborn Romans, hiding their origins by altering their names. Then there were the few who used their freedom to travel to see the world. For a slave, such a thing was unthinkable, impossible, dangerous. Even if a slave managed to escape, where would he go? Where could he go? A runaway slave would never get far before the patrols caught him. Even if he reached the coast, what then? He would need a ship to get across the sea, and who would captain such a vessel? Would risk their cargo being seized by the authorities. But as a free man, all of that was possible, legal even. A former slave could travel anywhere in the empire, visit any city he wished. But most didn't. Most were content to stay close to home, to where they had always been, even after they were set free. Many, many years later, after the plague had run its course and the city of Rome had slowly begun to rebuild, the streets were filled with the sound of hammers, the shouts of workers putting up scaffolding, the murmurs of architects arguing over designs. From their rooftop, a former slave watched it all. Below him, two boys raced across the street, their laughter echoing off the nearby buildings. One of the boys stumbled and fell, scraping his knee on the cobblestones. The other boy rushed to his friend's side, helping him to his feet. As the boys walked away, wiping the tears and blood from the scraped knee, the former slave went back to his work, a small smile touching his lips. It had been so long since he'd heard children laughing. So long since he'd seen them playing in the streets. So long since he'd seen them at all. For so many years, the only children he'd known were the ones who belonged to his master, the ones he'd been forced to tutor, to entertain. the ones he'd played with in his mind. Being free wasn't easy, not at first, not truly. There was the paperwork, the endless paperwork, proving who you once were, proving who you now were, proving you were worthy. And then there were the stares, the looks people gave you, the way they treated you, the way they spoke to you. Being free wasn't easy, but it was good. He looked down at the worn piece of wood in his hands, the only thing left of the cage he'd been sold in all those years ago. Back then, he had been 12 years old. His name had been Crestos. Had been bought and sold 3 times, worked in a silver mine, a marble quarry, finally winding up in taverns and brothels. In the end, it was a priestess in a temple of Venus who bought him, set him free, gave him the name Cornelius. It had been a long time, a very long time, but now he was free. And as he looked out at the city of Rome, the city he'd grown up in, the city he called home, he thought maybe that was enough. He wasn't free to go where he wanted, whenever he wanted. Still had to work. Still had to earn money. He couldn't read or write. His Latin was halting and imperfect. He had no family, no one who cared whether he lived or died, but he was free. In the end, that was enough. For so many, the journey toward freedom was a long one, full of setbacks, disappointments, betrayals. But as the years passed, bit by bit, they were able to put the pieces of their lives back together. Little by little, they reclaimed their identities, remade their lives. When they finally broke free of the chains of slavery, they discovered new ones. Chains forged of custom, tradition, fear. Still they carried on, held fast to the hope of a better day, to the dream of a life without chains. And even in freedom, the rhythm of their lives lingered. Death is universal. It doesn't care about your status, wealth, background. Even if it seems like it does sometimes, death is equal. All people, rich and poor, men, women, free or enslaved, they all eventually die. But how they die and what happens to their bodies afterward varies widely depending on where and when they live. So welcome to this house. Today we are visiting ancient Rome and exploring how Roman slaves were buried and remembered. Now before we begin, I would like to issue a trigger warning. This video contains discussions of slavery and violence against enslaved people. Slavery was an accepted and integral part of life in ancient Rome, and so it will feature heavily in this video as it did in that time period. As with many of my videos, there is some debate as to whether or not I should even make this video at all. However, I believe that studying the history of slavery can help us better understand the full scope of human history. Furthermore, I think it is important to acknowledge this difficult subject matter in order to learn from the mistakes of our past. My goal is never to glorify slavery or the actions of slave owners, but instead to shed light on the experiences of those who were enslaved. Slaves in ancient Rome could be purchased or born into slavery within a household. They would serve their masters for their entire lives and had few rights or protections. Life as a slave in ancient Rome was brutal and unforgiving. They were denied basic human rights and were considered property rather than human beings. Slaves were forced to work long hours in dangerous conditions with little to no pay. They were also subjected to physical and mental abuse, including beatings, torture, and sexual assault. Many slaves died young due to overwork, malnutrition, or mistreatment. Sadly, slavery is still a problem today. Millions of people around the world are still trapped in modern forms of slavery, such as human trafficking and forced labor. It is important to remember the suffering of those who have been enslaved in the past and present in order to work towards a better future. Alright, let's see how Roman slaves were buried and remembered. Most slaves in ancient Rome were not given any kind of burial after they died. Instead, their bodies were often burned and the ashes scattered. However, there are a few accounts of Roman slaves being buried, and some archaeological, and in suggesting that this was more common than previously thought. In the rare cases where slaves were buried, their tombs were usually quite simple and unadorned. Some may have been buried in mass graves with other slaves or in the same grave as their owner. Others may have been buried alone in a shallow pit or dug in the side of a hill. The graves were often unmarked, or if marked, only had a basic stone or wooden marker indicating their presence. If a slave had served their master well, or for a long time, they might receive a more elaborate burial. This could include a tomb made of stone or marble with an inscription or short epitaph. The inscriptions on these tombs were usually brief and to the point. simply stating the name of the slave, and perhaps a short phrase such as served well or died faithful. In some cases, the tombs also included the name of the master and the relationship between the slave and the deceased person. For example, one tomb bears the epitaph, "Here lies Felix, a slave of Marcus Junius Rufus, faithful valet and companion for 30 years. Another reads, "To the memory of Fortunata, who died at the age of 80, belonging to her loving mistress Cornelia." While most slaves were buried in unmarked or simple graves, there is evidence that some slaves may have been able to pool their earnings to afford a more decent end. Archaeologists have discovered a number of burial clubs from the Roman period, which suggest that slaves were able to save money together to pay for a proper burial. These clubs, known as collegia, were common throughout the Roman Empire and allowed members to pool their resources to pay for a funeral and burial. The practice was particularly popular among lower classes, including slaves, who were not able to afford the expense of a formal burial on their own. The idea was that by joining together, they could collectively afford a more elaborate ceremony and ensure that their deceased members were treated with respect and dignity. The typical burial for a Roman slave would have taken place outside the city walls in a quiet cemetery. The body would have been placed in a simple coffin or wrapped in a shroud and then lowered into a shallow grave. A small ceremony may have been held before the burial, but it is likely that the entire affair would have been rather somber and low-key. After the burial, the grave may have been covered with a simple stone or mound of earth, and the mourners would have returned to the city. However, archaeology shows us that some slaves were buried with personal items, suggesting that they were cherished and remembered by their loved ones. While most slaves were buried in mass graves or unmarked pits, some archaeologists have found evidence that certain slaves were buried with a few personal belongings. These items were often small and inexpensive, such as coins, jewelry, or pottery. In some cases, slaves were even buried with their favorite food or drink vessels, suggesting that they were treated with more care and respect than others. These findings indicate that at least some Roman slaves were viewed as individuals with their own unique identities and possessions rather than simply property. While the majority of slaves were not afforded this level of dignity, it is possible that certain slaves were able to build relationships with their owners or other members of society that resulted in them being remembered and honored after their deaths. By examining the few archaeological records available, we can gain insight into the lives and deaths of these forgotten individuals and appreciate the humanity they possessed despite their status in Roman society. So we can imagine that while most slaves were buried in mass graves or unmarked pits, some were able to save enough money to purchase a more elaborate burial. These burials, while still modest compared to those of free Romans, would have provided the deceased with a greater sense of dignity and respect. The ability to invest in one's own burial suggests that some slaves were able to negotiate better working conditions or higher wages with their owners, or perhaps they were able to use their earnings to bribe their way out of servitude. Either way, these individuals were clearly seen as more than just property and were afforded certain rights and privileges as a result. What do you think? What was life like for a slave in ancient Rome? Do you think the burial practices described in this video are respectful? Let me know your thoughts down below. Also, please don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more content. Your support means the world to me and helps keep this channel going. The market of souls was always bustling. The very air vibrated with the energy of many people. Here in this place, everything was bought and sold, and it was always busy. You'd think a person would get used to seeing people sold, but this is how one feels at first. But after some time spent here, one comes to learn that there are many things that never grow old. And seeing men and women and children being bought and sold isn't one of those things. One thing that did not change was the feel of the flagstones beneath one's feet. They were always cool and hard and smooth to the touch, polished by millions of feet over the centuries. Every day, these stones bore witness to the trade in human flesh and blood. These flagstones had seen it all. Nothing shocked them anymore. Today felt just like any other day. The sky stretched endlessly above, and the sun blazed down on the crowd below. Some were merchants hawking their wares, while others stood patiently waiting for the auctioneer's hammer to fall. The sounds of the city rose around you. Vendors called out the virtues of their wares. One hawked fine cloth from the east, another spices, while yet another proclaimed the exquisite taste of his olives. In the distance, a blacksmith rang his hammer on hot iron, And then there were the platforms. There were several of them in this market, but they all shared one commonality. Each platform had a plaque showing the age and skills of the person chained there. All around you, men and women stood in front of these platforms, examining their teeth, checking their posture, and testing their strength. These potential buyers treated the people as if they were tools. It was your turn now. You stepped onto the platform, and suddenly, the crowd's lights and voices felt way louder. A man came up to you and leaned in close, looked into your eyes and spoke. "You will fetch a good price, I think. Your teeth are strong and even, your neck is unblemished, and your muscles are defined. You're obviously strong and have worked hard in your life." His gaze flicked over your body and he continued, "I think you will sell for a lot of money today." It felt cold and strange to be examined like an inanimate object. It was worse when they tested your teeth because you had to open your mouth wide and the buyer peered inside. Felt powerless. You were about to be sold like an animal. The crowd pushed closer. The auctioneer cleared his throat and struck his gavel against his stand. "For sale," he announced to the crowd, "a strong young man, fit for labor and battle." The bidding began quickly, the numbers rising in quick succession. The auctioneer paused between calls, allowing the bidding to settle before continuing. "Do I hear 30? Going once? Going twice?" The chant rose and fell as the auctioneer repeated his calls. The potential buyers argued over the value of the item, and you wondered who would purchase you. Then a hush fell over the crowd, and the bidding stopped. The auctioneer waited, but no one called out a bid. The man on the next platform shouted something, and you turned to see him shake his head and shrugged his shoulders. Then the crowd shifted and parted. A woman hurried past, clutching a small child by the hand. She disappeared behind a pillar. The little boy tugged on her skirt. "But I want to see the gladiator," he said. She pulled him back. "Not now, my little one, not now." She hurried away, but the boy refused to budge. He squeezed his small fist and looked toward the platform where you stood. After what seemed like hours, the auctioneer brought down his hammer. "Sold," he announced, "to the young gentleman for 28. The boy stepped forward and reached for you. He looked up at you with big, innocent eyes. It was all you could do not to scoop him up and hold him close. But that would only make the separation worse. With a sad smile, you bent down and allowed him to climb onto your shoulders. He wrapped his arms around your neck, and you could feel the soft weight of the boy pressing against you. There was a moment of silence as you looked into the eyes of your former master. For a long moment, no one spoke. The crowd stirred restlessly, but no one called out a word. Finally, the man spoke. "You are dismissed." You straightened and slowly climbed down from the platform. The boy slipped to the ground and ran ahead. You walked away without looking back. As you left the platform, you heard the auctioneer calling out your master's name. "Felix Niger, the baker's son, has just purchased a slave." The crowd applauded, and you felt as though you were part of the spectacle. You followed the boy through a maze of narrow streets until you came to a large house. It had high walls and barred windows, but the courtyard in front was open to the sky. The boy ran ahead of you and opened the door. "Father, I have something to show you," he shouted. His father appeared in the doorway, wiping flour from his hands onto his apron. He looked at you with tired eyes. "Did you buy a new doll, my son?" he asked. The boy shook his head. "No, I bought a strong man. Look, he can fight." The boy pushed you forward. You knelt down beside a stone basin and dipped your face into the cold water. The water splashed across your cheeks, and you took a deep breath. You looked up to see the boy watching you intently. "What's your name?" you asked. "Felix," he replied. "Well, Felix, your new slave's name is Marcus," his father said. "From now on, you will call me Master Marcus." He nodded to the boy. "And you will call your brother Marcus." You looked from the father to the son and smiled sadly. You knew that the life you had known was gone forever. But what kind of life awaited you here? Would it be good or bad? Only time would tell. You spent your days working alongside Felix's father in the bakery. It was hard work, but it was honest work. You kneaded dough-shaped loaves of bread and stacked them into the oven. In the evenings, you played with the boy, throwing him into the air and catching him as he squealed with laughter. One night, while you were tucking Felix into bed, he asked you a question that had been on his mind. "Will my mother come back for me?" he whispered. You stroked his hair and lied. "Of course she will, little one. She loves you very much." You knew that wasn't true, but you didn't want to crush the boy's spirit. Felix grew quickly, and so did your affection for him. He was a bright, inquisitive child with a thirst for knowledge. You taught him to read and write, and he learned quickly. One day, Felix came running into the kitchen, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Marcus, we have to leave," he gasped. "Father is angry and he's looking for you." You frowned, confused by the boy's words. "Why is he angry?" you asked. "I don't know," Felix whispered. "He says you are a slave, and he can do as he pleases with you." You knew what he meant, and your heart sank. "I'll be right back," you told the boy, and hurried to find your master. You found him in the courtyard, pacing back and forth. He stopped and turned to face you, his eyes blazing with anger. "You have disobeyed me," he said. "You are a slave, and I am your master. You will do as I say." You met his gaze steadily. "I am no one's slave," you said. "I am a free man." His face contorted with rage, and he raised his hand to strike you. But before he could connect, you grabbed his wrist and twisted it. He cried out in pain, and you took that opportunity to knock him to the ground. You ran as fast as you could, with Felix close behind you. You didn't know where you were going, but you didn't care. All that mattered was getting away from the angry baker. You ran until you came to a large open space. In the center was a statue of a Roman emperor, and around him were the words to the victor, "The spoils." You looked at the statue and thought about your life. You had been a slave for as long as you could remember. You had been bought and sold, worked in the mines, and been forced to fight in the Colosseum. But now it was over. You were free. You turned to go, but a group of soldiers blocked your path. "Stop! In the name of the emperor," one of them shouted. You knew that there was no escape. The soldiers closed in on you, their weapons raised. One of the soldiers stepped forward and raised his sword. "Prepare to die," he said. Before you could react, the world went black. On the march, the dust is everywhere, in their mouths and their eyes and their hair. They taste it and smell it and feel it against their raw, red, irritated skin. The sun beats down on their necks, on their shoulders, on their backs. Sometimes they carry water in leather skins or grain in wicker baskets. Sometimes they carry just what they can carry, whatever is given to them to carry. They have no names, at least none that anyone remembers. So we will call them men. They march behind the legions, along the roads, through the towns, over the hills, and across the valleys. They come after the eagles have flown, and the maniple is marched. They come after the tents are struck, and the baggage wagons are loaded, and the cattle are driven, and the herders follow. They come when the dust has already settled, and the road is quiet, and the birds are singing, and the only shade is gone. They come under the hot sun and the relentless sky. They come into the evening, into the night, into the darkness, the deeper dark. The darkness of the tent, when the soldiers sleep and dream of Rome and their fathers and their sons. The men stay by the road, by the fire, where the kettle hangs over the embers, and the stew bubbles, and the meat sweats, and the bread soaks and the wine boils, and the day is done. And they watch the soldiers rest, the strong, young, noisy soldiers, and they envy them. For one moment, they would give anything to be soldiers, to be rested, to be praised. But they are not soldiers. They are slaves. They were bought with money, or captured with war, or born into bondage. Now they are nothing. They are no one's property. They are nobody. And yet the legions could not move without them, neither could Rome. For they are the ones who carry the stuff of war, who set up the camps, and cook the food, and mend the sandals, and make the tools, and haul the carts, and dig the ditches, and carry the wounded, and bury the dead. Without them, the legions would be naked and hungry and tired. Without them, the legions would never win a battle, never take a city, never conquer an empire. But they do not care. They do not want the cities or the gold or the power. All they want is to survive the night, to live another day, to see another sunrise, to breathe the fresh air, to taste the sweet water, to eat the hard bread, to find a scrap of meat, to earn another piece of silver, to get a cut of wood to keep the wolves away, to trade a kiss for a crust of bread, to barter a back scratch for a bowl of porridge, to gamble a hand of dice for a chance at dinner, to live at all. So they follow the legions step by step, and they watch the soldiers train and drill and parade and fight. And they listen to the drums and the horns and the shouts and the screams, and they smell the sweat and the blood and the urine and the shit and the smoke and the fire, and they hear the moans of the dying and the cries of the mothers and the cheers of the crowds. And they remember why they walk, not for glory, but to survive, not for honor, but to endure, not for victory, but to live. They walk through the villages, they walk through the towns, they walk through the fields and the forests and the mountains and the deserts. They walk across the rivers, the streams, the creeks and the seas. They walk over the stones and the dirt and the mud and the snow. They walk behind the columns of the legions, the invincible legions, the unbeatable legions, the magnificent legions. They walk behind the standards, the silver standards, the golden eagle, the Aquila. They walk in the dust, in the silence, under the weight, under the burden, under the sky. They walk at night by the light of the moon, by the light of the stars, by the light of the campfire. While the soldiers sleep and dream of Rome and their fathers and their sons, and they walk by the light of the torch, by the flickering light of the torches. While the soldiers are drunk and loud and proud and sing and dance and laugh and fight and fuck, and they walk in the dark, in the deep dark, while the soldiers patrol and guard and watch and wait and wonder and fear and die. For some nights the men gather around the fire and tell stories, stories of home and hearth and kin and country and gods. And some nights the men stay awake and watch the fire and think of the past and plan the future. And some nights the men pray to the gods, to the old gods and the new, to the many gods, and the few to the gods of the conquered and the gods of the strong, to the gods of the living and the gods of the dead. And some nights the men fight and kill and scream and cry and bleed and die. But mostly they walk in the dust, in the silence, under the weight, under the burden, under the sky. And sometimes the men see other slaves, men and women, old and young, chained and guarded, prisoners and captives, booty and plunder. And sometimes those slaves walk with the men, the defeated slaves, the broken slaves, the weary slaves, the men who have nothing left to lose, men who have nothing to give, the men who have nothing to become. And the men accept them, the tired, the hungry, the thirsty, the barefoot, the ragged, the sick, the wounded, the dying, the dead, and they carry them, for the men carry everything. They carry the supplies, they carry the wounded, they carry the dead. They carry the hopes and dreams and fears and failures and victories and defeats. They carry the stuff of war, the stuff of life. They carry it all. They carry it all, and they step by step, the rhythm of their lives follows the legions. This is the last house on the Via Sacra. The other houses line the road. This one hides down a narrow passage between shops and taverns and brothels. Slaves come and go unseen. They sleep, they eat, they work, all unseen. Their world is small and dark, just like this room where old Demetrius sleeps with his wife and daughter and son. The room is so narrow, you could touch both walls at once if you stood in the right spot. There's not even room to sit down anywhere, let alone lie down. So the family spends their days curled up on the floor, their nights folded in the corner. It smells like soot here, like it does everywhere. And the walls are worn smooth by generations of bodies rubbing against them, but also generations of tears. The family has been here many years, maybe decades. No one knows for sure because no one keeps track. Time is measured by seasons and festivals. The woman's busy making bread, kneading and shaping it right on the worn stone floor. Meanwhile, the man sharpens his knife on a rag, while the boy dashes outside to fetch water from the fountain. The girl watches her father, and when he looks away, she reaches out and touches his knee. He doesn't say anything. He can't say anything. But when her mother looks at her, she sees understanding in her eyes. She knows that her parents would rather be working the land than sharpening knives and kneading dough, but they do what they have to do. They make the master's meals. They clean his clothes. They mend his sandals. And for a few coins and a crust of bread, he lets them live in the room behind his kitchen. The girl dreams of a field one day, rows of vegetables and fruit trees heavy with ripening fruit. But her mother says there is no such place. Now that they're in the city, a farmer's life is no better than a slave's. Still, every evening before bed, the girl braids wildflowers into her hair and dances for her mother. She twirls and dips and weaves, and sometimes her mother smiles. It's late now. The oil lamp sputters and throws long shadows on the wall. Her father folds his robe carefully, smoothing out the creases. Her mother braids the girl's hair, whispering a story of a princess who escapes her suitor by leaping into the sea and becoming a mermaid. The girl closes her eyes, listening. When she opens them again, her mother is gone. She crawls next to her father and they fold together into a ball. The oil lamp sputters and goes out. The room is dark, filled only with the sounds of the city. A dog barks in the distance. A couple laughs as they walk past. A drunk shouts obscenities. A baby cries. And within the walls, the rhythm of their lives never ceased. The kitchen buzzes with activity. The cook stirs a pot over the fire, feeling its warmth on his thin shoulders. A slave pours wine into a clay jug, while another arranges bread, cheese, and fruit. The master will be here soon. He likes to eat late. The cook keeps an eye on the door, counting the minutes until he hears the rattle of the master's entourage, the soft murmur of greetings, and finally, the creak of the kitchen door. The master steps in, looking handsome in his fine purple toga and new sandals. He takes his place at the table, while the others stand around waiting. What will he say? Will he like the meal? The cook holds his breath, listening. The master speaks, and his words are kind, almost friendly. The cook relaxes, his shoulders easing. But once the master leaves, the kitchen goes quiet. The slaves straighten their posture and slowly uncoil from their tense postures. One of them moves to the corner where the oil lamp flickers, casting playful shadows on the wall. The others start clearing the table, stacking dishes on their arms. Balancing jugs on their heads, they carry as much as they can until the room behind the kitchen is packed. They stack the food on the rough stone floor and huddle together in the dark, eating quietly. Outside, the moon hangs low in the night sky, and the wind whispers through the cracks, bringing sounds of laughter and music. A dog barks, a baby cries, and a cat meows. Inside, the slaves quietly enjoy their dinner, each lost in their own thoughts. Once they finish, they wipe their fingers on a rag, saving the leftovers for tomorrow. Then they slip off their tunics and settle in for the night. Sleep comes quickly, wrapping them in its embrace. There is little time for dreaming. Soon the cock will crow, and it will be time to start the day. A young man sits on a step leading down into the room. He leans his head against the cool stone and closes his eyes. This is the only place he can think of that's cooler than the rooftops. The air here is still warm from the day, but it's a welcome warmth after hours spent hauling marble blocks under the hot sun. He feels the city's pulse in his bones, the chatter of voices, the clatter of carts, and the splash of fountains. He remembers the splash of a fountain in the courtyard of the villa where he grew up. He was free then. He was as close to free as a slave could be. But then the master sold him to settle his debts. Now he's stuck in the sweltering heat of a Roman building, hauling stones up ladders and laying them out on the rooftop, letting the sun beat down on him. He misses his family. He thinks about his sister, her hair braided with flowers, her skin the color of polished ivory, her laugh like the tinkling of bells. He imagines her sitting in the shade of an olive tree, sipping sweet wine, waiting for him to come home. He squeezes his eyes shut, savoring the memory of her touch, the feel of her hand in his. He doesn't know how long he stays on the steps, leaning against the cool stone. The sun dips lower, stretching shadows across the ground. He gets up, brushing dirt off his knees, and slowly makes his way down the ladder. Inside, the air is thick with the stench of stale sweat and urine. The oil lamp flickers, throwing playful shadows on the wall. A group of men huddles together, their eyes glued to the dancing flame. A young man joins them, settling down next to a pile of rags. One of the men nods toward the entrance, and the young man glances over before shaking his head. A silent exchange of understanding. They know the rules. They don't talk about escape. They don't talk about the master. They don't talk about anything. They just huddle together in the darkness, sharing the warmth of their bodies, finding comfort in their silence. When the lamp sputters and goes out, plunging them into darkness, the young man rests his head on his knees, breathing in the scent of worn cloth and stale sweat and faintly oiled skin. The sounds of the city drift in through the cracks in the wall, a lullaby that rocks him to sleep. There are no windows in this room, just a crack in the wall that lets in a little slice of sky. You can spot the constellations from here, the Big Dipper, the Bull, the Twins. The slaves know the stories behind those stars. They tell each other stories too, stories of freedom and home and faraway lands where the streets are paved with gold. The stories keep them going. They dream of a time when the walls will crumble and they can walk away from the only life they've ever known. Every morning they rise before dawn and jump right into their tasks. They cook, clean, care for the master's kids, mend clothes, polish jewelry, and run errands. They do everything the master asks of them without complaint. Sometimes they whisper to each other. They share news, gossip, rumors. They talk about the war and the earthquake and the new emperor. But most of the time they work in silence. Their only sound the scrape of a knife or the clank of a hammer. They work in silence because they know that the master is watching. He wants to hear nothing that might hint at rebellion or discontent. But the master can't hear what they don't say. So the slaves talk in whispers, their voices low, their words carefully chosen. They talk about the markets and the weather and the latest gladiator victory. They don't talk about chains or whips or shackles. They don't talk about anger or despair. They don't talk about death. Sometimes the silence is broken by the sound of laughter. The master's children are playing, their voices echoing in the courtyard. The slaves smile, their faces lighting up. For a brief moment, life feels almost manageable. Almost. The air is thick with the stench of wood smoke and urine. Hammers and chisels clink and clank, bouncing off the damp stone walls as the slaves labor in silence, their bodies hunched over their work. They carve marble and shape bronze, their muscles straining, their brows furrowed in concentration. The only sound is the scrape of metal on stone and the occasional grunt of exertion. As the hours pass, the room fills with statues and busts, each one a masterpiece. The slaves work with precision and skill, their tools moving with practiced ease. Each stroke of the chisel, each tap of the hammer brings them closer to their goals. Outside, the sun climbs higher in the sky, its rays streaming through the open doorway. But inside, in the dim oil lamplight, the slaves continue to work in silence, their faces illuminated by the glow of their creations. There is a knock at the door. The slaves freeze, their bodies stiffening. They've been working without stopping for hours, and the sound of the knock takes them by surprise. Who could it be at this hour? The knock comes again, insistent, demanding attention. One of the slaves steps up to the door, his hand hovering over the latch. After a moment's pause, he cracks it open. The guard stands there, his face unreadable. "Are the masters awake?" he asks, his voice breaking the silence. The slave shakes his head, his eyes darting to the unfinished statues scattered around the room. "They are asleep," he murmurs. The guard nods and turns to leave. As the door closes, the sound of hammering and chiseling resumes, filling the room once more. The slaves return to their work, their bodies moving with practiced grace, their tools flashing in the lamplight. The knock echoes in their ears, a reminder of the world beyond their silent walls. But they do not stop. They work through the night, their creations growing ever closer to completion. The unfinished bust on the workbench becomes a portrait of the emperor. The marble statue takes on the features of a Roman senator. The bronze sculpture begins to resemble a triumphant gladiator. The slaves work in silence, their tools singing, their bodies strong, their spirits unbroken. They pour all their strength and skill into their art, creating masterpieces that will adorn the city's grandest buildings and most opulent villas. The unfinished work on the workbench becomes a testament to their talent and dedication, a silent rebuke to those who would keep them in chains. And within the walls, the rhythm of their lives never ceased. From the earliest dawn, the agricultural slaves were compelled to labor upon the vast fields of grain that surrounded the Roman latifundia. These great estates owned by the wealthy and powerful, their days began before the sun crested the horizon, when the overseer would arrive at the slave quarters, a whip in hand and a schedule in the other. The air was heavy with the smell of dust and the sound of crickets still active in the cool morning hours. They roused the sleeping men, women, and children, urging them towards the fields where the day's labor awaited. The earth was still damp from the previous evening's rain, squishing between the toes of those who walked barefoot across its surface. After the slaves were counted, the overseer distributed tools and set the pace for the day. He moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, barking orders, checking the hours worked and ensuring that production met the quotas set by the owner of the estate. For the slaves, their hours were measured in a simple and brutal fashion. Each hour of work was marked by the striking of a bronze hand mirror held up to the sun. When the mirror flashed with the full brilliance of the morning sun, it was time to start. And every hour thereafter, the same mirror was used to measure the progress of the slaves' labor. In the early hours, they would plow the fields, drawing crooked furrows through the hard-packed earth. Later, they would sow seeds with calloused hands, dropping grain into the shallow trenches made by the plows. And as the season progressed, they followed behind the harvesters, gathering the golden wheat into rough piles. All the while, the sun beat down on their bare arms and necks, turning their skin the color of the ripe grain they handled so reverently. The work was back-breaking, monotonous, and unforgiving. Yet amidst the rhythmic clang of the reaper's sickle and the murmur of countless voices reciting prayers to the gods of the harvest, there was little time to dwell on the harshness of their fate. Each had their designated task, their role in the grand machinery of agriculture, and each had to perform their part without complaint. When hunger pangs struck, each slave received a meager portion of the very grain they had labored to harvest. Mixed with water from leathern skins carried by the overseers, it wasn't enough to stave off hunger, but it sustained them until the evening meal, which consisted of the same humble fare. In the rare moments of respite, they ate while standing, their hands still gripping their tools, their gazes fixed on the endless expanse of the fields. For the slaves, there was little difference between one day and the next. Each morning dawned with the same solemn routine. Each afternoon waned with the same weary resignation. The cycle of the seasons, with its vibrant tapestry of color and changing landscapes, was lost on them. Spring's verdant palette, summer's fiery glow, autumn's mellow hues, and winter's stark monochrome were all one to the agricultural slaves as they toiled under the unrelenting glare of the Mediterranean sun. To them, the seasons were but an abstract concept, a whisper in the wind that did not touch their own existence. For their days were measured not in the changing hues of the sky or the shifting patterns of nature, but in the relentless march of their labor. They were one with the soil they tilled, their bodies as weathered and worn as the furrows they carved into the earth. The wind that rustled through the stalks of grain carried their silent sorrows, and the dust of the fields clung to their skin like a second nature. Its grain of wheat, each stalk of barley, each vine laden with grapes bore witness to their sweat, their toil, and their silent tears. The very essence of the land was imbued with the echoes of their despair. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the fields, the pace of labor slackened. The overseer, his work for the day nearly done, marked the final hour with a mirror's flash, and the slaves, their bodies aching with the memory of endless hours under the sun, shuffled back to the quarters. The evening brought with it a brief respite, a stolen moment of quietude amidst the cacophony of their lives. With the embers of the day's toil glowing in their limbs, they huddled together, sharing tales of hardship and dreams of freedom, their voices hushed but resolute. For even in the depths of their despair, the flicker of hope refused to be extinguished. But as the stars began to pepper the night sky and the moon climbed its celestial throne, the time for rest was nearly over. Soon, the rhythmic crash of the loom would blend with the lowing of cattle and the bleating of sheep, creating a mournful symphony that accompanied their sleepless nights. Theirs was a world of ceaseless motion, where even the darkness held the promise of more labor to come. For the agricultural slaves, the boundaries between night and day were blurred. The darkness brought little respite, for the nocturnal hours were often filled with the soft thud of the weaver's shuttle or the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer. The loom's monotonous rhythm echoed the heartbeat of their servitude, weaving tales of captivity as intricate and inescapable as the tapestries they adorned. Each clanking of the hammer on the anvil was a reminder of the chains that bound them to their master's whims. Even in sleep, their dreams were haunted by the specter of labor, chasing them through fields of wheat and vineyards, their cries for mercy lost in the rustling of leaves. Within the sprawling confines of the latifundia, there existed a disconcerting harmony between the rhythms of nature and the drudgery of their lives. The rooster-esque crow heralded the coming dawn just as surely as it signaled the beginning of another day of toil. As the rooster crowed and the sun ascended higher in the heavens, the agricultural slaves continued their unending labor. Theirs was a life devoid of leisure, a perpetual cycle of sowing, reaping, and laboring under the relentless gaze of the sun. As the hours ticked by, measured not by the changing light, but by the unfaltering rhythm of their work, the slaves moved like automatons, their bodies responding to the ingrained compulsion of years of servitude. With hands calloused from years of toil, they guided the plow, their gazes fixed on the furrow ahead. The rhythm of their labor was a somber counterpoint to the vibrant pulse of nature all around them. The bees' drowsy hum, the birds' melodious songs, and the rustling whispers of the wind through the stalks of grain stood in stark contrast to the monotonous drone of the slaves' chants. Their voices, though hushed, wove a haunting melody of despair that mingled with the sounds of the fields. The sun, a silent observer, cast its unwavering gaze upon them, measuring not their sorrows, but their hours. Its light glistened on the beads of sweat that traced paths down their sun-kissed forearms, reflecting the toil that etched deep lines onto their faces. Lines that spoke of countless seasons endured and whispered tales of lives lived under the open sky. Their bodies, bronzed by the sun and etched with the memories of countless harvests, bore witness to the passage of time in the most brutal of ways. With each sunrise, they marked another year closer to the setting sun, their existence measured not in moments of joy, but in the relentless march of their labor. Beneath the open sky, the rhythm of their lives was endless. Some slaves worked in the silver mines of Spain, and others toiled in the bronze and iron foundries. In the furnace rooms, men would huddle together in the dim oil lamplight, sharing scraps of news from distant provinces. The latest craze among the masters was gladiators, men who fought to the death for the amusement of the crowds. When the master was gone, the slave named Astranius took the hammer and nail from the rack. He had been watching the gladiator fights. It wasn't the blood that fascinated him, but the way those condemned men fought with skill and cunning. Now he held the nail like it was a sword, and he struck at a block of iron. His action was so precise, so swift, his fellow slaves watched in silence. The smithy echoed with the ring of iron on iron. In the market, the aroma of spices and incense mixed with the stench of stale urine and decay. Among the crowd, there were merchants and aristocrats, freed men and women with shaved heads and scarred bodies. Some slaves moved through the market untethered, taking care not to meet the eyes of anyone. Others dragged chains or war shackles that locked them to their masters. A few slaves walked ahead of their masters, carrying goods or leading animals. The crowd parted before them. Their faces were impassive, their gazes steady. They knew how to walk among strangers without drawing attention to themselves. In the evening, when the city had emptied and the houses closed their doors against the darkness, the young girl crept out of her room. In the courtyard, beneath the indifferent gaze of the moon, she gathered pebbles and drew letters in the dust. She wrote her name over and over. It was a tiny act of rebellion, one that neither pleased nor angered her master. Most slaves never escaped. Those who did rarely traveled alone. They moved in groups, guided by the North Star and an unshakable determination. One night a slave couple slipped out of their master's house, moved quickly, hugging the walls, avoiding the main roads, their shadows long and thin in the moonlight. They reached the river, waded into the current, and let it carry them away from the city. Dawn painted the sky with streaks of pink and orange. The water was cold, and the wind carried the scent of rain. But the couple kept moving until they disappeared from sight. Sometimes slaves resisted in small ways. They broke tools to make their masters think someone had stolen them. They dropped a hammer or let a bucket fall to the ground, making it useless. If they were caught, they accepted whatever punishment their masters handed out. Sometimes the resistance was more subtle. A pot left half full, a fire left smoldering, a well left unfilled. It was risky, dangerous work, this quiet disobedience. But these slaves had learned that they could make their masters suffer too. From the windows of their tall marble palace, the mistress saw the vibrant colors of the sunset bleed across the sky. The deep red was her favorite. She stood in the center of the room, letting its vast emptiness wrap around her like a shroud. Her silk gown rustled softly as she moved. There was no one to disturb her reverie, no one to judge her solitude. The old slave poured the oil into the lamp. The flames sputtered to life, chasing away the shadows in the corner. Outside, the wind moaned like a hungry wolf, rattling the shutters against the window frames. The old man sat down on the stool beside the woman. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the soft crackle of the fire. The first snow of winter fell silently. It piled on rooftops and covered the streets, muffling the sounds of the city. A mother held her son's hand, her fingers knotted around his small one. They walked slowly, their breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. The boy looked up at his mother, his eyes wide with wonder. Deep in the forest, the trees stood like silent giants, their branches heavy with snow. The air was still, the silence broken only by the crunch of footsteps on the frozen ground. Beneath a thick canopy of leaves, the trees hid their tracks. At the edge of the village, a young man stood, watching the last rays of sun disappear below the horizon. The chill of the evening crept up his arms, pulling him back to the present. The stars were just beginning to appear when a woman emerged from the trees. She hurried toward the man, her steps light and swift. In the arena, the crowd roared as the condemned man fought for his life. Sweat dripped from his brow, mixing with the dust of the arena floor. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, he disarmed his opponent and raised his sword high. For a moment, their eyes met, and the condemned man saw his own fear reflected back at him. Then he plunged his sword deep into his opponent's chest. The crowd went wild. Among the spectators, a slave girl clutched her companion's arm, her eyes wide with fear and excitement. The smell of roasted meat and wine hung heavy in the air, mingling with the sweet fragrance of the roses that adorned the banquet table. Around the table, men and women laughed and talked, their voices echoing in the vast hall. At the head of the table, a man raised his goblet high, his face flushed with wine and power. He had been watching the grain harvest for weeks, waiting for the fields to ripen under the summer sun. When the time was right, he called the workers together. They came from different corners of the empire, their faces weathered and worn. They had toiled since childhood, their bodies bearing the marks of their labor. The man surveyed his workers, their gazes fixed on the ground, their shoulders slumped. Most of them had known nothing else but slavery. That night the moon was a thin crescent, offering little light to the world. The man walked along the edge of the field, his shadow stretching out before him. He paused, listening to the wind rustling through the tall stalks of grain. The sound was almost a whisper, but he thought he heard something else, a low murmur that seemed to come from the earth itself. The girl woke up before dawn. She sat on the edge of her bed, her bare feet touching the cold stone floor. Outside, the sky was the color of pewter, heavy with rain. She slipped out of her room and moved through the silent corridors of the mansion. The great house was empty, the servants still asleep. She found a ladder and climbed up to the roof. From up here, she could see the entire city, the winding streets, the distant hills. A strong wind whipped across the rooftop, tugging at her thin clothes. She closed her eyes, letting the wind buffet her body, lifting her hair from her neck. She felt free. A middle-aged woman sat in a corner of the marketplace, her gnarled hands resting on a pile of cloth. Her eyes, though faded with age, were sharp and clear. Around her, merchants hawked their wares, their voices competing with the bleating of sheep and the clucking of chickens. The woman watched the shoppers haggling over prices, their faces flushed with the heat of the day. She saw them sizing up their purchases, testing their weight and quality. She saw the hunger in their eyes, the desperation that drove them to seek bargains. And she saw in them a reflection of herself, a mirror to her own struggles. With calloused hands, she had mended countless garments for her masters. She had stitched together scraps of fabric, patching holes and hiding flaws. She had turned old rags into new cloths, making them presentable, even beautiful. She had done this not because she had to, but because she couldn't bear the thought of waste. For her, every thread, every stitch, every piece of cloth was a testament to her humanity. It was a way of preserving her dignity in a world that had stripped her of everything else. Now, watching the shoppers, she saw a glimmer of hope. Maybe in their eyes, too, there was a spark of resilience, a stubborn refusal to be defeated by the world's harsh realities. Maybe they, too, found ways to mend and make do, to hold on to their humanity in a world that sought to diminish it. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the marketplace, the woman packed up her meager wares. She folded the cloths carefully, tucking them away in her basket. She walked away from the bustling crowd. She carried with her the memory of shared struggles and the faint hope of a better day. And even in silence, resistance joined the rhythm of their lives.